All right, folks, welcome to another episode of the Counter Media Podcast, where we cover everything the media won't and the government doesn't want you to know about. I want to say hi to everybody over there and make sure that you go ahead, like, subscribe, all those good things that you're going to do. Throw up some comments. We will definitely be getting to your comments. We'll be talking with our guest here in just a few minutes, and we will definitely be reading your comments and taking your questions toward the end of this thing. But we have a lot to cover. There's breaking news that's happening. It's relevant to this discussion as well that we'll definitely be picking Kyle's brain about. And we got Chris coming to us from the future in Australia. What's going on, Chris?
Hello, everyone. Hello from Australia. It's nice and, well, actually, it's a little bit overcast today, but yeah, doing pretty well. How's America going?
It's going amazing. It's going amazing here in America. Don't worry, we're going to be annexing Australia pretty soon too. You're on the list.
Yeah, well, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it.
Real quick, I do want to say hi to everybody over in the comments and make sure you guys, I know, we're streaming live right now on X, Rumble, and YouTube. And we actually get Rumble comments now. I still can't get over that. I'm really happy about that. And Facebook as well. So I want to say hi to Jason, TG Sponsor, God's Offspring, AM Atkinson, Metal Seer. And make sure all of you that are coming in now, make sure you say hello over in the comments. And if you're watching this live, that's great. But also, if you're watching this in the future, make sure you're joining us. We typically run every 8 p.m. on Mondays and Thursdays for the Counter Media Podcast. And then we also have our Dangerous Liberty podcast on Wednesday. And we have a very special guest coming to you on Wednesday. I think that one's going to be pretty cool. We'll post that tomorrow, so check that out. So I want to say hi to everybody over there. We got Drones Under 2A, Char S, Khan, Lori Matthews, and many, many more. But without further ado, let's go ahead and bring on Kyle Seraphin. Thank you very much for coming on. Really excited to talk to you. And welcome to the Counter Media Podcast.
Thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, man. So if you will, I know, I think most of our viewers probably know who you are. But if you will, just give a little background of your professional experience, how you kind of came to podcasting, I guess. You kind of needed another job, basically.
That's true. Yeah, that's exactly right.
You got away from the Fed side of it. But if you will, just introduce yourself a little bit. Tell everybody about your background and where you're coming from.
No, I'm the most unlikely podcast guy. I didn't plan on doing it, although I was pretty good at yelling into my phone and leaving rants when I worked for the FBI to all my buddies, in audio messages. And they were like, "That's a podcast." It's like, no, it's not. That's just me being pissed. I kind of worked various jobs in sales coming out of college. I went to college at the University of Oklahoma and got out and I took a victory lap there, ended up in San Francisco, worked in radio, worked in manufacturing sales. Worked a couple other jobs, ended up running a restaurant. And I tried to figure out what the hell I was doing in my life. So I took a job at Warner Brothers working in finance. So as you can see, mostly private sector experience. And I was going why am I not serving? Why am I doing something of value to the world? Ended up enlisting at the age of 27, went to the Air Force for just shy of 4 years, which was kind of a failed attempt to get into special operations. Failed maybe because of the way that things work over on the Air Force side, which my buddies who are Green Berets say, thank God you didn't stay longer because then you'd be gay. And I'm not. I'm married. I've got a couple of kids, so that's helpful. And anyway, so I got out of the Air Force, went into, again, private sector, started working on an ambulance, hospital, et cetera. Threw my hat in the ring for the FBI, kind of forgot about it, and ended up getting hiring and going to Quantico in 2016. And I worked for the FBI for about 6 years. So I spent the first 2 years doing Chinese counterintelligence. Then I was very jaded about what they did in counterintelligence, disliked it pretty intensely, and looked to find a route out. And the route out was doing surveillance, which I did for 3 years full-time as a special operations group guy, which might as well be called special observations group. And then my last year was in Las Cruces, New Mexico, working on an Indian reservation, which is kind of the bastard redheaded child of what the FBI does. That's when people started hearing about the whistleblower allegations I brought forward. In all fairness, I started doing that in 2017 internally. I only went external in October of 2021. And then in 22, they removed me. Late 22, I was on Dan Bongino's podcast, kind of launched out talking about malfeasance and misadventures and abuse that the FBI was involved in. A lot of Americans were seeing that through January 6th and through FACE Act violations and them going after the Catholic Church, which I exposed, and some other stuff. So it just became kind of a natural outgrowth that in order to keep the FBI from kicking down my door, I needed to be loud. I needed to have a presence. And so I started a podcast to do that. And so far it's been feeding my family. So thanks to all the people that watch.
Oh, that's awesome, man. Yeah, no, first of all, thank you for your service and all of the above. And thank you for having the courage to come forward and actually not just sit back. I've been part of many organizations where you see corruption, malfeasance, and just too many people just sit back and just watch it happen, or just think that they accept that as a norm. And it's courageous to guys like you that really are. I mean, a lot of people don't understand when you go and you're launching the accusations that you did, or you're whistleblowing, even at the smallest level. I mean, you are literally putting your career on the line. You're asking to be demonized, to have your reputation smeared. That's what these agencies do. And I know, having worked for federal agencies, having lots of friends in federal agencies, and what ends up happening is a lot of times these guys, they just move on to another job, which is the path of least resistance, because their conscience doesn't allow them to stay where they're at. But at the same time, the problem with that is that it propagates the problem, right? It creates a culture. And unfortunately, what it does is also it weeds out the guys that want to do things the right way and want to uphold and defend the Constitution as the oath is. So, guys like you, man, I can't thank you enough in the bravery that takes. I don't think a lot of people really appreciate it, because, when you're in the middle of all that, you don't know that you're going to go off and, be a successful podcaster or whatever else.
I'll tell you what's kind of funny. So I was talking to another FBI whistleblower last night. His name's Kurt Suzdak. I've had him on as my guest before. He's a wild animal, like 24 years in the Bureau, like fully ADD, just like constantly like chasing squirrels and shiny objects. And we were identifying the phases of kind of how things went down with the way that the Bureau was able to attack whistleblowers and how that game changed. And we're in maybe the fourth phase right now. He represented the third phase, where he actually showed that for the first time, somebody could actually bring a lawsuit and win. And he's a brilliant attorney, and he's diabolical when it comes to policy and being able to read and just see between the lines and the angles. So he's the kind of guy you want on your side. And he actually represents whistleblowers professionally, kind of as a side gig right now. He works in cyber as well. But one of those really bright guys that kind of turned the tide. And he said, I always say that I was the third movement, and so that was it. And there was no other movement until you showed up. And he said, you were the worst client that I ever had, because he would go, this is what you ought to do. And I go, well, then what happens next? And he's like, yeah, then they're going to crush you, but at least you'll be doing things the right way. And I go, well, I don't care about getting the job back. And so the one thing that I did that I don't think anybody did before that was that I basically said, I'm redefining the terms of winning. Everybody's always assumed like it's getting your job back, it's getting back pay, it's somehow being made whole, it's being able to live comfortably, or like you get an apology, whatever that is. I said that the end goal is basically destruction of people who are evil. There's a bunch of people inside government bureaucracies that are evil, and they just exist because other people just go, like you said, they move on to another thing. For me, it was never about that. It was always about, and it's never about actually other Americans, if I'm being totally honest. Like, I want to be it's a charitable thing you said, but it's about my kids. I was like, how am I going to look my kids in the eye and tell them, yeah, there was government tyranny. Yeah, I saw it. I knew they were doing things that were wrong, but I kept a roof over my head. Like, is it that option, or do you just go full bore into it and it costs whatever it costs? I've always been one of those guys that kind of like enjoyed the suffering thing. Like, if other people around me are uncomfortable, I kind of got a kick out of it. It was my funniest moment at the FBI Academy. Like, we're doing push-ups on our knuckles, which is not that big of a deal. And we're just on concrete, on knuckles for a little bit. And we're just bracing and holding the push-up position, which I've done for hours on end and, failed and all that kind of stuff. And there's this noise coming out that I've never heard before. And it's like the sound of people that are suffering out loud. And I'm just wondering, like, who told you to make noise? And so I just had this big smile on my face. And they're like, you think it's funny, Seraphin? It's like, no, I think it's hilarious. Like, this is my favorite day. And then my next favorite day is when they all got pepper sprayed in the face and people were crying. And I was walking around handing out towels. I was the happiest guy you've ever seen. So I've got that kind of sick thing that some people have, where if it gets harder and things get weirder, like, I'm into it. I want to be part of that. And it makes my day feel better than knowing that like things are going to get weird. Right now, we're in the middle of like a bunch of senior executives at the FBI crying, trying to figure out what's happening around them, watching their careers melt down for no particular reason, even though we all know what the reason is. They don't. Yeah. They thought they were the good guys in the story. And it's fun to see it. Like, this last 2 weeks, I don't like to be a vindictive person, but I do like accountability, and we're seeing a lot of that. So that's been fun.
No, I think it's amazing. And I agree. Like, watching bureaucrats just completely burn and crash the way that you are. And I completely agree with you. I always, regardless of what phase or portion of my military experience was in, watching people suffer around me is what kept me going so much. Like, knowing that I'm like, man, I am not as bad as that guy right there.
That's right.
It's like made me feel so good about myself. No, there's some psychological issues that you and I both have. But
well, I married a counselor, so for whatever it's worth, my wife has a master's in counseling, and that was not on accident. She was actually getting her it was a strategic acquisition, like get vertical integration. She was actually getting her master's degree while we were dating, and so I don't think that was accidental. And the fact that she's a professional communicator is probably really helpful because, like you say, when you have some issues, you should recognize them and then bring the resources in house. That's much smarter than letting some outside authority deal with it.
I love it. And she had her own research the whole time. Like she was getting so good at her job the entire time that she was going to school.
I totally radicalized her, by the way, now, because she's a homemaker with 4 kids that like makes sourdough, mills her own flour, like has her own weapon systems, knows how to maintain them. She's got a 20 gauge in the pantry and her own AR upstairs. Like, so she came from a girl who was living in Brooklyn, New York, to being like a full American in a pretty short order. We've only been married for like 12 years now, so that's pretty good.
I'd say that counts as winning.
America.
The cancer is winning. Is that what you said?
I'd say that counts as winning. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
I love it. Yeah. So, I'm really curious to pick your brain a little bit regarding, well, let's start here. What are some of the things that the FBI has been doing that most Americans just don't know about? Let's start there. And I'll to give you a little bit of context of why I'm asking this. Again, I'm right here in the Northern Virginia area near Winchester, Virginia. I'm like, I don't know, 35 minutes away from portions of DC. We're Loudoun County, where we had these school board folks that were getting yanked. One of my friends was one of the sheriff's deputies that was ordered to arrest just a parent, and then later on was part of an investigation, a federal investigation of some of those parents. So besides that, what are some things that people need to be aware of that the FBI is either still doing or was doing that they just don't realize?
Yeah. So let's start at the beginning, I think, which is that most people think of the FBI as a law enforcement entity and agency, and that's not specifically accurate anymore, at least the way the FBI looks at it. You can actually go to their documents where they say there's a document called the DIOG, the Domestic Investigations Operation Guide. So that's your handbook on how you open cases and what you can and can't do and how long you can leave things open and the requirements for all of that stuff. So it's the guidebook to get through it. And most of it's unclassified. You can find one going back 2011 is the most recent one they've published. There's a couple later editions. But right up front, they describe the FBI as intelligence agency first. And that should really make a lot of like alarm bells go off for most Americans who think of it as being sort of like people who catch bank robbers. In fact, if you do the bank robbery work in the FBI, that's looked down upon. That's considered low level. I don't think it is. I think it's actually really important. And it's what Americans should expect from law enforcement agencies. But that's not what the FBI thinks. So it's worth knowing intel agency first, and it constitutes maybe 60% or even 70% of the mission. And then the rest of it goes over to the criminal side. And under the national security banner, as an intelligence agency, there's kind of 2 facets to it. Part 1, counterintelligence. Part 2, counterterrorism. Both of them are important missions. Neither one of them are being prosecuted properly by the FBI because what they're doing is spinning off things for the sake of intelligence as an intel agency and not as an operational entity that's trying to get criminal prosecutions out of these things. And so that was really, really eye-opening to me when I first stepped out. So 2016 at the end, early 2017, as I'm working in counterintelligence, I'm getting all these cases. There's no allegation of criminal activity. There's literally no violation of federal law that we're investigating. And I've got long-term cases on people that are 6, 7, 8 years long. And you're going, well, what are we doing? And so I asked that, like, what the hell are we doing? Like, why are we investigating these people? Why do I have all their financial records? Why do I have every toll record they've ever made? So that's phone calls and text messages, like to the numbers they're getting in contact with. Why do we have all this? Why do we have surveillance reports of who these people are and they're talking to? And their answer was, well, when we have it, then we know more things. And that's really spooky because I went like, well, what are we going to do with it? And they go, oh, we'll just know more stuff. And I'm like, no, that's what happens when you have more information. You know more things. But what is the goal? What is it an aid of? And so I'm going to give your audience kind of a visual depiction to imagine. In intelligence cases, counterterrorism or counterintelligence, they're circles, okay? And they're like vortexes because they spin off new circles. And they don't ever have an end. They don't have to have a beginning all the time. Oftentimes, they'll just predicate off something else that's already existing. So you get these spinning circles that don't need to end. And the goal is, if I have something to write at the end of the 90-day cycle for my file review, then I'm winning as an FBI agent in that space. So I constantly just need to put paper in the file. I need to write something down for each of my cases and keep them going, which is why they last 6, 7, 8 years with no goal, no end plan. The other side is criminal activity, which nobody's going to have a real major problem with, except when they do things like, weaponize it. But when we're talking about the actual action of doing criminal prosecutions, federal crime happens, someone was engaged in it. The FBI learns of it, allegation or information that it happened. So they go after it and they get evidence. They try to identify subjects. That's what we call them. We don't call them suspects. We call them subjects. And once you are able to get enough evidence against it, you bring an indictment. You might have to do a criminal complaint where they're arrested or they're surrendered. And then you're going to go through trial or they're going to plea out. And that's it. It's just a straight line. And there's some appeals and that's the end of it. It does have an end because the goal is criminal prosecution. But if that's only 30 or maybe 40% on a good day of what your agency is doing, you've got this national security apparatus with all of these crazy powers from FISA and collection and interface with the CIA and the NSA, and both of those are real. And then you're going to do what? You're going to just know more stuff about Americans. And if you happen to find out about a crime, I'll give you the worst example of this. And I think we can probably in this group agree that terrorism is not something that we want. And I don't like jihadis and I don't like people that are involved in that. And we don't like pedophiles. Is that pretty universal?
Yeah, sure. I think we all agree. And if you don't, go.
So
go
we had
watch the show.
Northern Virginia. We had a guy who had an open FBI counterterrorism case on him as a potential jihadi, but no evidence that could actually be cited. No violation of federal law for 23 years at a mosque in Woodbridge. 23 years they investigated this guy. And when they finally got him, because they eventually found some federal crime after 2.5 decades, it turns out it was a child pornography case, which is sketchy to begin with because I don't know exactly how detailed it was, but they found child pornography on his computer, which of course he contested. And after 23 years, you might wonder what the hell was going on. Did someone just decide to flip a switch? Because we're talking about people that have access. They have, sources into this stuff. There's a lot of money behind this, and they want to eventually get something. That's really troubling. You shouldn't be able to leave investigations, even to people you don't generally agree with ideologically. That's just dangerous in America to think that we have a free society where you have an open license to just keep a case open until you find something or until you make something up or until you instigate that, which is a big problem in the post 9/11 world. We've seen the FBI basically introduce terrorisms to people. Oh. And when I say that, there's been whole movies on it. I did it with Janessa Souza earlier. And Whitmer's a great example of it, but it was very late stage. If you guys want to know kind of the evolution of how it played out, essentially, and I think you probably had a role in some of this stuff on the overseas side of it, because that's just what the military did. It starts off that after 9/11, Americans adopted a new definition of national security. We said, rather than we're going to protect the Constitution and people die in that, we said no American dies from terrorism on U.S. soil. And once you accept that zero fail mission in the United States, you're going to have tyrannical outcomes. So they started looking for what's called IT, or international terrorism. The U.S. military tied them up both conventionally and with special operations all the way overseas in various theaters that are acknowledged and unacknowledged. That got done pretty well. So you ran out of them being sent here because people were tied up overseas. They had far, far less. And at some point they went, well, what are we going to do? So they found people that were radicalized in the United States that were looking at foreign ideologies. And that was called homegrown violent extremists. So HVE is a term that some people have heard. That's what it means. Imagine like a first generation American who's got Somali descent, who's looking back and finding Al-Shabaab or something as an ideology. So they figured that out. Or you find somebody that's got Middle Eastern ties to, Al-Qaeda or whatever. So we find those people, but we ran out of them as well. And while they were looking at people in the United States, what we call USPers, U.S. persons, people that have a right and a legal reason to be here, they went, well, screw it. We'll just look at American citizens too. And that's when you started seeing this thing called DVEs. And so that's how you have domestic violent extremists. And that's going to be started off with like white supremacy, which is really easy to kind of, cry about. But there's just not that many of them that are really violent. It's just pretty uncommon. So then you start looking around and you start finding other things. And then the government finds itself in the business of adjudicating what is and is not dangerous speech. And that's how we got things like Mike Glover popping up on a list of militia violent extremists, which is really challenging and troubling. It's one of my whistleblower disclosures, actually. I brought that forward. You got other stuff like them going after Catholics in Richmond, Virginia, because they like the Latin Mass and they think Vatican II was a problem. Like, that's pretty troubling when you're going to go start saying that because you like to hear Gregorian chant, you might be a white supremacist. And it got broader and broader. They went after a thing called anti-abortion violent extremists, which is like, I guess, old ladies praying outside of abortion clinics. So that evolution is where the FBI is spending its time. But that's how it got there. And I think a lot of people don't really realize that.
Well, no, that's good information. I think that's important. I think the other part of that, two things kind of come to mind when you're talking about and laying that out is, number one, it seems to only go in one direction politically. I find that's one of the most troubling things that I've seen over the recent years. It's one thing if the FBI is just trying to, be so liberal casting its net so that we can, just like you said, zero chance of any sort of homegrown terrorism or terrorism here in the United States, that, they make mistakes. But my biggest problem with that, I have, and there's still a lot of Fourth Amendment issues going on there, but the other part of it is it seems to be strictly or extremely political. We're not seeing the same type of investigations or just people being watched as closely when we have much more evidence of leftist extremists actually committing violence and things like that, as opposed to what we see on the right. Then they brought into the white nationalist movement, or what I felt they were creating a white nationalist movement narrative, at least. So what's your answer for that, or what was the justification with inside the FBI for that type of situation?
So I'll do kind of like what I think is the origin story of why it is lean to the left. First of all, people who work in the government tend to lean left because they work for the government and they think the government is good. I think the government is evil. I'm the kind of guy you generally want working for the government because I'm constantly looking, going, if we want to shut this thing down, like, I'll lock up the door and turn off the lights. That was my first thought when I got to the Bureau. And so people like me are kind of the people that don't generally work in government. We're kind of contrarians in that space. Yeah. But what I think happened is, and I heard this term from Sarah Adams, so I'm going to give her credit for it. It may come somewhere else. She's been on Sean Ryan's podcast a number of times, but she talks about the politicization of intelligence work. And so when you start getting into the intelligence sphere, which is a post 9/11 phenomenon for the FBI, where that portion grew dramatically, they also rely a lot on credentialism. Yeah. A lot of intel analysts don't have on-the-ground experience. They are not an enlisted person who spent a bunch of time like watching a screen and then, deployed to a field and spent time with a team that was kicking doors and developing like in the field intel. That's not generally what we think of as being intel agencies. We think of people with advanced degrees. They understand like a lot of the history. They understand the culture. They might have the language skills. They have a degree in business. They have a degree in international relations and so on. And so they rely on this credentialism. And the more time you spend in academia at this point, the more likely you are to be radicalized harder and harder to the left. And if you're only going to hire those people, and my buddy George Hill, who was an enlisted both Marine Corps intel guy and then also in the Navy, and then also spent time at the FBI for 11 years, 5 years at the NSA. So I saw all of it, both, military and civilian. The thing that he said is that we've got all these GWAT veterans that are highly capable, intelligence gatherers and analysts, but they don't have a college degree. Why don't we make a path for these people to come in, whether they have a bachelor's or, if they have an associate's degree and work their way up? And the answer was shut down right away because people don't want that. They like the system the way it is. It feeds the machine the way they want, and it generates predictably left-leaning folks inside the government, particularly in the intel agencies. So that's why you end up going after like fake white supremacists. I'll just give people an example. I did a fair number of surveillance cases on white supremacists. We'll put that in air quotes because it's safer. And when I say that, I'm like, it's a 22-year-old kid with boat shoes on, wearing khakis with a polo on, that's drinking like a macchiato at Starbucks, but he's tweeting like racist stuff on Reddit. Yeah. And like, that guy's not a threat. And also, what are we doing out there? You're going to generate $10,000 a day of FBI salaries doing surveillance on this guy with photographs and any contacts and locations for what? Like, it never turns into prosecution. And so if that's what we're going to go spend our time doing, there's no Yahtzee moment there where the guy finally like agrees to like, I don't know, shoot up a black church. It just doesn't happen. Those don't turn out. And the ones that are going to do that, they're not on the FBI's radar because they're doing it quietly. And then they just go do some lone wolf stuff that they haven't talked to anybody about. If you're talking to people on the internet with all of your worst ideas, there's probably a Fed in there that's part of it, whether they be what's called a confidential human source or whether they be an actual FBI undercover employee. Like, if somebody agrees with all your crappiest ideas, especially the violent ones, and they want to help you do it, and by the way, they could probably do it for the amount of money that you have, like, that's a Fed. You're about to get set up and you're about to have the same experience as the Whitmer guys or like any number of other people. And they've happened on the left and the right. They're just trending more and more towards the right in, let's say, the last 15 years to the point where it's almost exclusive at this point.
Yeah. And folks, I just want you guys to know, I'm looking at your questions. I will be I'm tagging those so that we can go back and take a look at them, but we are going to we'll definitely let you guys jump in on the conversation more to the end. So you can write your questions down and we'll go back. I can basically highlight them and I'll go back and check them out and bring those to Kyle as well. Well, the other thing that I was thinking about, but when you were kind of going through that lineage and where this all came from, the other part of it was, you were talking about how the bad guys were tied up overseas. Well, the other thing that we had tied up overseas was, the most powerful, most sophisticated surveillance apparatus to ever exist. We were also tied up overseas. And it does seem to me that once that GWAT started kind of rolling down, we started pulling more out of Iraq and then ultimately pulled out of Afghanistan. That's where we saw, the eye of Sauron get directed right on the American citizens. We had all these people, all these capabilities, and we had no game to play anymore. So we brought it home to us.
It's the oldest thing in the world. It's about government funding. I always tell people it's kind of like a sump pump. Like a sump pump's supposed to have an automatic shut off, but if you run out of water and it's still pumping, it'll just burn the pump out. And so whenever you have this intel apparatus that is meant to collect things and it gets paid to collect things and it has metrics that are assigned with how many intel products it can pump out and talk about awareness, if they're not doing domain awareness overseas, they're going to start being aware about what's happening here. And so these people just look around and they go, how do we use these tools? Because the contract still exists and the money still needs to roll in. And there's a lot of people that are assigned to it. So it's not necessarily coming from a bad place. It's like the oldest thing in the world. My job is important because it's my job, not because of a mission that I fulfill. And the minute you lose sight of the mission and the outcome being the goal, then you end up with like classic government and all these things live forever. I mean, Ronald Reagan said it, the closest thing to, eternal life on earth is a government program. And we might see a little change to that under Donald Trump, but it's going to be a massively uphill battle for all these like announcements. Like we're getting rid of the Department of Education. It's really obvious to those of us who have seen the bureaucratic gridlock that exists to be able to keep you from doing that. Unless you find the shortcut or people opt out, you're not going to be able to get like just a machete going through red tape. It just doesn't exist. That's the way the system is set up. It's meant to fail anybody that wants to be efficient.
Yeah.
It kind of reminds me a little bit of that quote from Madeleine Albright. I think in the 90s, she said something about the military. It's a little bit different, but same kind of principle. She said, we've got this great military. It's a shame we can't really use it too much. I forget the exact quote, but maybe it's a similar thing with this big intelligence apparatus. You've got it. You've been using it overseas. May as well keep using it. You got a lot of money and investment and employees.
Yeah, they'd hate to see it go to waste. I mean, it's perfectly capable of doing the thing it's meant to do. It just needs a good target, and one target's good as another if you don't have any sort of ethics and if you don't believe that the Constitution is meant to govern you. And I'll throw this out there as this is my supposition, and I'm happy to hear other opinions on it. But intel agencies kind of work in a semi-unconstitutional way to begin with. That's sort of the nature of what they do, and they're meant to work overseas on purpose. Once you start bringing them into the United States and we have Fourth Amendment concerns, we've already lost something, because the way that these entities are designed is not for lawful search and seizure, lawful searches with criminal prosecution. And once you bring them into the same house, I actually said it with Sebastian Gorka, who's actually been brought into the new administration, and he was 100% correct in this analysis. When you have intelligence married up with law enforcement, it's called a secret police. And it has been in every single Western experience and a lot of Eastern European experiences as well in our lifetimes. Like it's the thing that you should avoid. And for some reason, the political left is celebrating it, which, makes it kind of make them line up more like commies again, I guess. You get the idea that they really love it as long as they're in charge. God forbid they lose control of it, though.
Yeah, and it's definitely creepy. And not only is it creepy, but Americans, unfortunately, they're able to do what they do behind closed doors, and it's not as obvious until we start seeing these weird prosecutions, or we start seeing, surveillance being conducted on a presidential candidate and all his cabinet members and advisors and everything that we saw with Donald Trump. If it wasn't for Donald Trump's his first and ultimately his second presidency, I don't think any of this stuff would be in the forefront of American, visibility and their situational awareness to begin with. We really did find out through them going after Donald Trump and kind of rattling the cage. I don't think they realized how big of a blowback they were going to get, both from him, the fight that they were going to get back from him, and then of course his supporters. So it really is pretty creepy. And even going back to what you're saying, there's still a lot of good people, within these intelligence divisions that are even domestic and all those other things. And, there is even a legitimate argument to be said, hey, we've created this intelligence apparatus that we're using overseas for good use. We had our own intelligence collection methods, and we worked with the NSA, the CIA, and we got a lot of bad guys because of that. Like there's legitimate work being done. And there is a legitimate almost reason as we pull those assets back why we need to keep those spun up and capable so we don't lose those capabilities. But turning those onto the average day American citizen is not the way to do it. And it's a hard balance, and we clearly have gotten way out of whack on that, without a doubt. And we've definitely, it's almost mind-boggling to me that there are Americans that are sitting behind those desks and sitting in meetings every day and saying, hey, you know what, we're going to go after this guy. We don't have a warrant, we don't have probable cause, but we are still going to continue to investigate this guy with really nothing other than maybe some Facebook posts, some YouTube, whatever it is. And that's what's happening, and that's what's crazy to me.
It's totally crazy. I'll say this: I've become more of I've been more interested in the faith aspect of this, because when you get kind of crushed by a government and something that's so big, the left, I think, actually thinks that the government is God and provides all the good things in the world. And it's almost religious if you listen to the way they talk about it. They don't know what they're talking about oftentimes. They've never read the Constitution, but they have this like very religious fervor about supporting the government. And coming from the other end of it, I feel like we actually were spared something. Sometimes you look back at something, an operation you did, a training you did, or some sort of a mission set, and you just go, thank God that mistake happened, because without that pause, without that disruption, without that moment that unsettled what our rhythm was, we might have just steamrolled through and just kept doing something. And having that break allows you to do like either an in the field after action or a quick analysis and a snap judgment to try to change path. That 4 years of Joe Biden actually, I think, was really critical. And I think we're going to go back. I think that Americans 10 years from now, 20 years from now, will look back and see that hiatus was the difference between, because if we had continued down a Donald Trump era, like think about it, they'd already impeached him twice. Everything was on the table. They were talking about shutting down the entire economy. And we were listening to this thing and people were just going like, well, that's just what you got to do. Things that have never been done in my lifetime, not in yours either. We're going to shut down the entire country from import and exports, and we're not going to go and do any normal things. Kids are going to stop going to school. Like, what in the hell are you talking about? And it seems semi-normal.
And put the entire Constitution on hiatus. Like,
yeah, we're just going to pause all of America. We're going to turn off the America switch for a bit.
Screw your freaking religious rights. Screw all of that. Something with a death rate of like 0.03% or whatever it's come down to.
That's right.
Is all the justification that we need to completely do away with our constitutional rights and human rights.
But then we had that break, and honest to God, that break, and it got stupid during that break, no doubt about it. Like, I lost my job during that time. I know a lot of service members were kicked out, good people. Got friends who were Green Berets that got kicked out. I got friends that were conventional service on every service, branch. And they all just said, look, end of the day, you can do a lot of things, but what you can't do is you can't break federal law, and you're not supposed to be able to do that. And we supposedly learned something with the anthrax vaccines, and there was all this lawsuits that got done, and then they just ignored all of it. And they just said, no, you're going to comply because we said so. And all of those 4 years built up a head of steam that I think actually powered Donald Trump 2.0. And more importantly, and the craziest thing that happened is the man had 2 legitimate assassination attempts that got this close. Yeah. One of which hit him in the ear, which is absolutely absurd. And obviously that's how you guys got together. The second one was equally crazy, that there was somebody waiting out there.
Or anything.
What's that?
So we're not dating or anything. I just want to.
Right. But even the fact, men change things. I think 2 things will change a man. Number one is when you face kind of like a moment or a possibility where you could have died, and you evaluate things. And that's intense. And it can be, change the way you look at things. It's much more interesting when someone starts targeting your family members and your family gets brought into it, and you suddenly realize it's not just about me and it's not just about my personal safety, but it's like about the little people that I'm responsible for in the world. And somebody decided to come after them. I mean, it turns things loose. I think what we've seen, this like lion that's been ripping through the field right now, is, it reminds me of that Christopher Walken scene where he's talking about the pool hall. What is it called? Pool hall junkies? You know the scene?
No, I don't know what
he says. Something like, essentially, it's Christopher Walken. He's talking to this guy who's a pool hustler that's been losing, and he's kind of streaky, but he's the best pool player there is. And he just says, the lion can lay around, and all the hyenas will come and nip at his food, and the vultures will come and laugh at him, and the other animals will screw with him. But every once in a while, he gets up and he just kills everything that he can see. He runs it down and he just slays it in the grass, and there's blood that stains all the grasses, and nothing knows what to do, and nothing survives, and nobody's laughing then. And it's like, they woke up something when you come after somebody's family, especially a man who's going to get the presidency the second time. I would have guessed 1/5 of what has happened so far, or slower. I would never have given you the last 12 days that we've seen of Trump's presidency I would have never said that this was going to be a high likelihood. So it's fun to watch. But if you look at the reasons of it, it has to make sense that somebody put him to a decision for all his chips a couple times, including his family's. And the man's coming back and he's like, I'm delivering on all this. I get one shot. Let's do this. It's fun to watch. Like I said, I'm glad it's a good day to be a podcaster and not an FBI agent.
Well, even Chris and I have talked about that a little bit regarding, Trump is known for, his negotiation tactics has always been shoot for the fences, act like we're going to do X, Y, and Z, and then we kind of lower expectations a little bit, deliver a little bit less. But he's not. Not delivering.
He's got rid of that last step.
The left put their foot on the gas for the last couple of years. We watched him basically step on it. I kept saying, look, they indicted him locally. They got him in a state prosecution. They got him in federal. They had him in civil. They had him in criminal. They were doing all the things in multiple jurisdictions. And there was nothing you could convince me that was going to say that these people were suddenly going to go, okay, that's enough. We're going to just pull over and look at the view. Like they were going Thelma and Louise. They were going off the edge of the canyon. And so the answer is one good turn deserves another. The left has spent decades building up the power of the executive branch, which is their own downfall. And they were saying, how can we turn the executive more and more into a king? And it's like, well, now you got a real pissed off guy that is acting as a very powerful executive, and you built that. So it's the same thing Mitch McConnell talked about when they said they were going to nuke the filibuster and they were going to, make it possible to approve judges. He's like, this will come back and you will live to regret it. It only takes one political cycle because Americans get sick of people that abuse their rights. And so, it's literally 4 years. It's like game on. Here we go.
It's like they were building up this massive apparatus thinking that no matter who gets in, Democrat or Republican, they won't do what Trump's doing. It's like they weren't expecting sort of such a rogue cannon like Trump.
Yeah.
Being treated the way he is, sort of getting his back to the wall, getting all fired up. And now he's, basically got like a revolutionary mandate. He's got a mandate not just to do this, that, and the other. But, I mean, I can't think of what would be too far for Trump at the moment. He could probably... Look, very exciting times.
The previous guy simply pardoned his entire family for charges that didn't ever happen and, preemptively pardoned people. The only time we've ever seen the preemptive pardon was Nixon. And it was pretty obvious that there was something that could come down the road. And that was how you healed America, is that you have Ford come in and he's going to pardon Nixon because, we're going to forgive the mistakes of our last leader and try to move on and close that chapter. That's different than saying my son is a crook and has been for the last decade and a half. And by the way, I'm going to go ahead and pardon him for anything that's been indicted or not indicted. And also, I'm going to pardon all my family members. All bets are off.
And all the
For sure. It's like, look, you guys, you ripped up the rule book. Don't be surprised. I used to have this analogy. So, Gary, Chris, you guys tell me if this rings true with you. But the goal, or the way I've always seen politics, because I've never been a political guy, you just watch it and you see, okay, this is what's happening. Republicans, people on the political right, kind of play by the rules, and they may be playing checkers if they're simpletons. They might be playing chess if they've got some sophistication, so they're working the game. The left comes in and drives a monster truck through a park that has a bunch of these tables set up and just smashes the hell out of the board. They don't care about the rules. It's like, what can we get away with? We've got a bigger truck, we're going to smash it, and it's tolerated. So if you can get away with it, they would do it. And so you're finally seeing someone else coming in with a bigger truck and just smashing them over. It's monster truck, derby now. And they're terrified because they've never experienced someone playing by their own rules. And that's what needed to happen, unfortunately, for them.
No, I agree completely. And I've said that for a long time. Like the left doesn't care about decorum. The left has never cared about any of that. And, we're sitting over here, just like you said, we're drooling on ourselves as Republicans playing checkers and saying,
we can't do that.
We're going to pull back.
That's not proper.
Yeah. We got to be bigger than them. Well, you're losing. So, maybe that's not the tactic that you need to continue down the same road because you're losing every single, you're losing honorably. I guess that's great. And you got a little bit more, dignity left with you, but you're still losing.
But if you're not first, you're last. That we got to go rookie Bobby on this thing.
If you're not cheating, not trying.
Mm-hmm.
So the Republicans want to be honorable losers. They're happy with that.
And they're really good at it.
As opposed to winners that get a little bit dirty sometimes.
Yeah. They make losing look sad. Before I forget, this is one thing the one thing that I've been wanting to ask you that maybe you do or don't have insight into. Patriot Front.
I have a lot of insight, actually.
I am 100% convinced that is almost wholly a creation of the FBI. What say you?
I say not even a little bit.
Really?
Yeah, and that upsets people because they want to believe the conspiracy they have. So here's the deal. I did a 4-hour debunk on this, not intentionally, but telling the story of a guy named Zach Schaufstall. He was actually removed from his job as the FBI supervisor, what's called the senior resident agent in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, where there was a big mix-up in 2022. It was a pride parade or a pride event in the park, and then they sent out these Patriot guys. There was like 31 of them in a truck, right? And they all got arrested, and they had the masks on, and famously they were like kneeling and cuffing them and keeping the masks on for some damn reason, and just a bunch of shenanigans, okay? So the backstory of what went on there is actually really, really eye-opening. Essentially, and this is from Zach's story, but people I've heard, throughout the FBI, I've got friends that were actually trying to do that investigation. There was no probable cause that there was a federal crime that was going on there. The FBI wasn't interested in investigating it because the folks that were there have already been adjudicated. They all have these pledges, and they've never actually caused any violence after they broke off at Charlottesville and became whatever they became. They were called something else before that, and now they're called Patriot Front. And I've seen them at the March for Life when I was out there with my wife. I've seen them a bunch. You see them, they don't look like conservatives. They look like clowns, like doing weird stuff. So the story goes...
The thing is, like, they look so over the top, it looks contrived.
Well, and it does. And listen, it's fairly sophisticated. If you go out there and read their manifesto, it's definitely got blood and soil. It definitely has this sort of like white nationalism, which I think is different than white supremacy, but it feels the same to me. And so you read it and you're like, okay, this is all BS. Like, this is not real. That being said, it's not FBI because the FBI didn't want to investigate it. They kept turning around saying, look, this is not interesting to us. If they were trying to bust guys in there, they would have had carte blanche to do so. What happened is the DOJ was pushing it because they had a LGBTQ nonsense motivation to try to get these search warrants. And Zach ended up losing his job because he refused to sign off on a search warrant that didn't have actual probable cause, like the standard of what you would do. And his agents couldn't find it either. And while they were doing it and trying to research whether or not they could find probable cause, whether there was enough in the ideology historically, every field office that had investigated these guys, which was a bunch, were reaching out and they're like, look, we don't have it. All we see is they act non-violently, they do stupid stuff, they march around, and it all falls underneath a protected First Amendment operation. Now, could that be something that DHS was involved in? Like HSI doesn't have any rules, so maybe it's HSI. Could it be somebody over there on that side of the coin? It certainly could be an intel op being run by somebody in the United States government, but it's not an FBI op because they tried to push this forward and people lost their jobs over it. And a lot of people came forward and said, we don't actually back it up. They were actually backing Zach until they realized it was a lesbian and a transgender parent that were in play. And then suddenly the game shifted. But up until that point, FBI headquarters was 100% behind. There's no PC. This is a nonviolent group. They are not interesting to us. We don't want to do it. If you were going to do an op like that, the only reason that you would set up an op, because I've seen them. I mean, I've seen these setup jobs. They're not few. They do it all the time. And the way that these things set up is you basically get a couple of people that are either undercovers and or CHSs that are going to be in the leadership that steer towards violence. You try to get a violent action or at least the plot to do violence. And then you wrap everybody up and then you get what's called a statistic. So you have a dismantlement of the group, which is a red, little shiny gold star. You have a disruption of a potential dangerous event. So that's another gold star. And then you have all the arrests. And then you can use sophisticated techniques, which might be a Title III or a FISA or whatever. And then you got the surveillance out there and maybe you put a drone up. Like you can do all the cool guy stuff that you do. And then you justify your budget. That's the only reason that op would exist. And so if they were going to do that, they would have had all the abilities to pull the triggers on these things, and they're not there. So I get kind of irritated only because I think it's really dumb and simple-minded when you see everybody out there. And people that are smart, they just don't know. They haven't been exposed to it. But the folks that you talk to inside, it's like, could it be an op? For sure. Is there probably like a number of people that are recruited as CHSs? I'm sure of it. Like there's no reason that they wouldn't be. They definitely have been. But they're not driving them towards violence, which would be the only goal of running said op. And so the fact that I think the guys from Patriot Front actually like being called FBI and feds, I think they actually dress that way on purpose because it's a ton of free publicity. They constantly, if they march anywhere, every conservative, group throws out there where they've been marching, if you think about it, and they get a couple of recruits out of it. So it actually works really well. It's, it's bad publicity, but it's a few people are like, well, I'm into what they're about. And they don't need a lot of recruiting to maintain what they're doing. That's my take on it. People can disagree, but I've seen a lot more than most. I have a huge instinct to call out the FBI when they're wrong. I actually was part of a whole movie that did that. And if I thought that those guys were legitimately running around as feds, I'd be happy to do it. I don't think they're
holding water for the FBI.
People say it all the time, though. That's the other funny thing. They're like, you're a fed plant. Like now you're revealing your colors. I'm like, dude, I have no idea. Like
same thing because I said, well, I won't even get to that. But here's my take on my perspective of what I think that or thought that I'll take your word for it. I believe that, your information is credible, and I'll take that over what I believe or my perspective on it. But my perspective on it was that they were more of a information op campaign that, they were intentionally left to where they weren't, like, we were seeing them in the news all the time, but yes, they were never violent. But it pushed the narrative that we have a major white nationalist movement afoot. And then when you go back and you say, well, you know what, we didn't have probable cause and all these other things, like the FBI has been prosecuting a lot of people without probable cause.
Well, they did the search warrant. So they did the search warrant for whatever it's worth. They just didn't have the PC on it. So they ended up actually getting prosecuted in Coeur d'Alene for a thing that was called conspiracy to riot, which was a misdemeanor locally. And you could do that. That's fine. But they couldn't get a federal nexus to it because there was no violence in the ideology. And so they fell short on being able to predicate the case on this. All of this stuff is kind of like very procedural and boring. And I agree with you that there's an information op that's going on and that they're trying to push forward that there is white supremacy, which if you look at the two people that are the co-signers on the main intel bulletins that go out talking about this, the FBI is one, the other one is DHS. And DHS doesn't have the rule book the FBI does. It doesn't have anywhere near like sort of the boundaries because they don't work under the Attorney General. So if there was going to be an info op that is run, and I don't have any visibility if that's the case, it wouldn't shock me if it was. It's just not a very good op. You know what I mean? Because it's not generating what they're looking for, which is violent actions. They're the same damn people. You can see them. They walk around. Like, you can identify some of them. The leader is very clear. He seems very smart for whatever it's worth. He's an articulate, intelligent guy who's got some really dumb ideas, or, he's selling something that people want, and not very many people do, but it's enough to keep them afloat. I mean, everybody's got a niche, I guess, if that's what they're into. So,
sure.
It's sort of reminds me a little bit. In Australia, we have a similar. Just recently, we had Australia Day, and here in Australia, without getting into all that, some on the left, they protest Australia Day. They call it Invasion Day because of the English colonialism displaced the Indigenous people. Anyway, so it's a bit of a battle about whether to march on Australia Day with the Australian flag, even showing the Australian flag is like becoming a little bit revolutionary on. Anyway, that's the context. On Australia Day, there was a group. An extremist group, and they literally call themselves the National Socialist Movement, and they marched in black shirts, and they got the Australian flag, and they marched, and they didn't do anything violent. They just sang an Australian sort of folk song, Waltzing Matilda, and a bunch of them got arrested. And I'm not even sure why. I think Australia's introduced, I don't want to get in the weeds, but we've introduced rules against like Nazi symbols or something, and maybe they got them for that. Anyway, long story short, a lot of people are suspicious of them being feds as well, or some kind of operation there to somehow justify police further restricting freedom of speech and all that. But I generally don't think they are, and I sort of thought the same. Well, I wasn't sure with Patriot Front, but I can't imagine it's a similar thing. They just are some extreme people out there.
Yeah, there's a couple racists in the world, it turns out. Chris, how excited are you going to be to celebrate Columbus Day when we annex Australia, do you think?
There's a bit of a sore spot, because I am, at the end of the day, I am an Australian patriot. I love America. I don't really want to be swallowed up. So I think this friendship might end if it comes to that. So hopefully not.
This is going to run for about 3 months now. You better practice up on that Star Spangled Banner, brother.
It's not happening.
It's coming. Look.
I think if we do
take this country from my cold dead hands. Okay.
So Gary, if we do it though, it should be on wooden ships, so we can actually do kind of like a throwback moment. I think they might appreciate that.
They don't have guns, so we can come over there with freaking slingshots, and we're gonna. And they just give up anyhow. They like rules. They're cool with anybody rolling over them. They're happy.
I just hope Trump keeps busy enough and he sort of forgets about Australia. So
it's possible. There's a lot to be busy with.
Yeah. Stick to Mexico, Canada, Greenland, maybe Panama.
Yeah, it's a target-rich environment here in our hemisphere.
Yeah, plenty there to work with.
Let me explain the game plan. Your PM's going to piss him off. He's going to throw down some tariffs, and then the next thing you know, we've annexed you. Well, that's how it works. Like, they just give up. They give up everything.
Yeah. But judging by Mexico and Canada...
all the nuclear subs that are just hanging out off your coast are going to just surface and just kind of move in and just checkmate you right there.
Yeah, because we had some kind of deal with the submarines where we get to use them, but really it's probably
you get to use them as long as we're running them and have all of our people on them. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was all part of the plan going back a while. I should have seen it coming.
Yeah, just doing battleship over there. Brutal.
It rains one time, and all of a sudden, your little flag just magically turns into the American flag. That's what I'm waiting to see.
It just wilts away.
No, well, I'm looking at Mexico and Canada, and it seems like he's talking tough to get them to do stuff. So he put the 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada, and then basically he's agreed to like delay them while they've done what he wants to do.
I mean, as far as I could tell, I think all of Seventh Group has had a big war boner for the last couple of weeks since they did the FTO declaration. So, like, I don't know, I wouldn't rule that out. They just take your time to get people ready.
Let's be real. If you got a green hat on, you have a constant war boner that never goes away.
Yeah, that checks.
Yeah. So let's get into a little J6. So
okay.
let's talk about J6. What you know, what you think. You know, Ray Epps. There's all these questions out there. I'll just leave it at that. I'll let you take it wherever. I'll let you pick it up and run with it however you want.
So J6 always looked like a trap to me. I lived in DC at the time. I was living in Fairfax, and I had friends that were FBI agents that wanted to go and wanted to protest and were pissed. They thought the election was a sham. They thought that there were at least obvious questions that were not being answered, and our agency wasn't properly investigating them. And they were like, I'm going to go to that rally. And I'm like, you're going to lose your pension. That's what you're going to do. That's a bad idea. You should not do that. I don't know why I felt that way, but I did. I actually went out and did a shooting course. I did a red dot shooting course with a Modern Samurai Project on that day.
Oh, nice. That was almost a running joke prior to that. Like, oh, you go there, you're going to get arrested. And, because again,
it felt like that. Yes.
Yeah, we're right here too. And I had a
even Gavin McInnes, head of the Proud Boys, I think he said the same thing beforehand.
It's just like a stupid way to go. Look, so I'm 100% in favor of Americans protesting. I'm 100% in favor of people having their voices heard. There is a time when when you are going to set yourself up for worse decisions. I don't like crowds. I'm sure that's probably not foreign to you, Gary. Like, it's just not a thing that I want to go do. I don't want to go where there's a bunch of uncontrolled, stupid people and people.
You can't carry a gun.
Yeah, and honestly, like if I'm anywhere, when I was like at the time I was an FBI agent, I don't want to be in a crowd with a gun unless I'm completely low visibility and I have no operational requirement to act, and I didn't want to be there. So I was excited that I took the day off, and the fact that they let me take the day off, that's warning number one. January 6th should have been declared what's called an NSSE, a National Special Security Event. I've kind of beat this drum a little bit. There should be more discussion on this in the future in the halls of Congress, I hope. This is the serious problem. An NSSE is something that the federal government declares. It's a DHS entity, but it goes under U.S. Secret Service. And they do it all the time. Like every year, the State of the Union, NSSE. The Super Bowl, NSSE. The 4th of July parade that goes in Washington, D.C., NSSE. Every inauguration is an NSSE. And when you have 41 or whatever the hell the number was, events that are permitted for people to come and do speeches, and you're expecting 500,000 people. So March for Life, NSSE, as far as I remember. They're putting people on the ground to walk around in undercover roles. They're not really undercover. They're called low visibility. But you're walking around covertly and looking for people that are causing problems so that Americans can exercise the amendment, that they're supposed to. They're supposed to be able to have a First Amendment right. They're supposed to be able to speak, whatever that means. And they're supposed to go and be able to protest or gather or petition Congress and so on. So there's always people that gather and they put all the tactical teams on alert. They put all the resources available. The FBI has a dive team for the Washington field office. I used to be the medic for, and so they would be on their boats, So you've got everybody is supposed to be in play. The Department of Energy is out there with their Raven teams, and they're out there sniffing for nukes and things like that. Everybody's keeping drones out of the sky, nukes away from the crowds, doing the thing they're supposed to do. That did not happen, and so. It's kind of interesting. Everybody hones in on certain figures that got a lot of notoriety because, let's say, Ray Epps, right? He was the top of the list, and then he disappeared, and he was apparently a source at one point in time, but maybe he wasn't. And everybody thinks he's this thing. He set it up. He's got stupid text messages because he was self-aggrandizing. At the end of the day, I talked to J6ers who were there and did journalistic activities and were out there observing the crowd, and they're like, the reason why Ray Epps is not that interesting is because the things he did were not that exceptional. He was just a guy on camera that got caught saying that specifically at that time, and it went big and viral on the right. It doesn't mean other people weren't saying dumb things like that. A lot of people were. Sure. He was exceptional because he stepped forward right away and worked with his attorney to get a deal. That sounds like that happened almost immediately. So, smart for him. Do I think that he was on the payroll of somebody? Probably at some point. The odds are pretty high, and that would be an embarrassment for some federal agency because that's why you remove people from that. But that doesn't mean that he set it up or that he engineered it. There were a lot of people doing dumb stuff.
I don't think he necessarily set it up or engineered it. I think he was a provocateur.
Yeah, whether he was told to provoke. So here, let me before you weigh in on, let me explain something about sources for folks that don't understand the way the Bureau runs them specifically. Everybody runs sources differently. FBI sources are incentivized to get what are called statistics. I talked about it earlier. Those are your gold stars. Imagine it's like a quota for writing tickets. Okay, so there's a checkbox that you've done a fill in the blank law enforcement activity, and your boss gets credit for it. That's really what it comes down to. The boss gets credit. They're incentivized to build cases, because when you build cases and there's prosecutions and there are statistics that go along with it, sources get paid. And sometimes they do it because they're told. They're specifically what we call tasked, right? That's a standard term. So I've told you, I need you to go out and do this thing, and you go out and do that. I need you to go to this event and do the following things: observe, report, take pictures, jot down names, get IDs, take pictures of people's badges, whatever. And then you do that. That's a tasking. Some people take it a little bit further, where they're out there in the general, and maybe let's say they know that they've been paid for other stuff, and they know that cases get built when bad things happen. And so maybe they're incentivized to see something bad happen. So they want to be a provocateur or an instigator. They want to push the crowd a little bit within the legal limits to see if they can get it to do something, because then they're going to have first eye view of what just happened, and they can report on it and they can get paid. And I think January 6th was a mixture of a couple of things. I think there were some people that were tasked possibly to do some things, but I don't know that the FBI did it specifically, but I wouldn't rule it out, certainly within the capabilities. I don't know that even FBI headquarters knows all the people that were there involved or what the taskings were of the individual case agents that were running it. But I know for a fact that they sent sources in. I know that because they requested sources who were available for tasking in a nationwide, what we call canvas. So that definitely happened. Other intelligence agencies and other law enforcement entities were there, in fact, and they have their own sources doing their own protocols, right? And some of those people want to get paid, and they know how they get paid. They get paid when shenanigans go down. So,
and I do think that's part of this that gets lost. There's 15 other agencies that have 15 other divisions that are all working independently of the FBI. The FBI the American people end up lumping all of that under the banner of the FBI.
Totally.
And that's why the FBI agents that are sitting there in front of Congress can sit there and say, oh, we had this amount of people, or we had this. Some of them know, especially as a director, you're going to know, hey, you know what? The NSA, other elements had sources there on the ground doing X, Y, and Z. But
so my buddy Scott, my buddy, what's his name? Steve Baker believes that there were, TF Orange guys there on the ground. And he's been working to prove that kind of stuff. And so it's like, well, maybe that's true. Maybe it's not. If it is, it's a big problem. But if there was a group in the soft community that leans a little bit more to the left, at least down the middle, that's the group that does it for all the reasons of who they are and why they are. And, we'll just leave that off at that. But if people want to go watch interviews with Steve Baker, he's talking about it recently. The other thing that's even bigger, and I think it's worth knowing, is, like you said, there's no information clearinghouse. There's no one group that knows what's going on or what's happening at any given time.
Right.
And so there's also the way to talk around things, that you can do it when you're in the community. And I know the FBI director did that. They released an Inspector General report the other day. And people will see it. 26 undercover or 26 confidential human sources were in the crowd that were attributed to the FBI. Okay, fine. What about professional sources? Were they listed in the source book? What about hip pocket sources, people that were working on behalf of folks but not on the books? They said there were no UCs, undercover agents. But UC is like a trademark. If you're a UC, that means you've gone through UC school, that you are qualified and you have the UC certificate. That doesn't mean that you couldn't go operate in an undercover role. It doesn't mean that you didn't operate in a plainclothes role, which every FBI agent does. Right. And what my team used to do professionally, we were not UCs, but we would walk around under nominal backstop and minimal cover. We could, fly under a false name. We could give you a false name and give you a fake backstory that would be semi-backstop, probably not very hard. Yeah. Just to cover for today. And so that is not the UC. And so how many FBI agents were physically on the grounds in plain clothes that were actually on duty doing, First Amendment audits, keeping a track of making sure that people weren't leaving packages behind trees and stuff like that? Because that's stuff I've done. So there's a lot of shenanigans that get played with the official terminology. And that's what goes into reports. And that's how you end up on the Hill testifying, saying things that they're not really true, but you didn't lie. You've been shading around it because these guys are playing games with words. And I know you understand how those word games go. And that's how they dodge this stuff. And that's how they give Americans less information than they really deserve.
Yeah, the thing that I think troubles me and troubles most people when it comes to Ray Epps is the fact that he was so we have a lot of footage of him, right, doing clearly instigating and trying to incite whatever. Yep. And the problem is that he ends up he gets a slap on the wrist, where there's other people that did far less than what he did. And, were prosecuted, ended up spending a lot of time in jail. And I think that's the problem. And and what makes people suspicious of him. But like you said, it wasn't just the FBI on the ground. There's DIA assets, there's CIA assets, and then there's 50 divisions within those umbrellas that are working independently of each other, that for multitudes of different reasons, that are out there claiming everything from, we're just looking for foreign intelligence officers, and we're just doing counter surveillance and surveillance detection and all of these things, when in reality they're there to help create a narrative. And
I would bet some of them weren't. I bet some of them were there for good reasons, which is the other problem. So like when the world is a gray place, and so that information space is very gray as well. So we're talking about essentially seeing people who were nefarious actors, people that were neutral actors, people that were positive actors and attempting to do their job in an honorable way. They all get lumped in there. We're going to see something really ugly, I think. The fact that they've queried all the names that worked in the FBI. Look, I got no love for any person that's working in the FBI in so much as I don't think they have a right to a job, because I just don't care if the FBI exists anymore.
Yeah.
But I also think that if you opened up a case on what's called AFO, assault on a federal officer, that's bread and butter stuff for the FBI. They do it every day when somebody attacks a Border Patrol agent. So if somebody punched a cop or allegedly punched a cop and you're investigating it, and you open that case, I don't really have a problem with you doing that. Now, if you open cases on misdemeanors, which no one should be doing, like, you should have the book thrown at you. And if you don't have a job tomorrow, like, I'll high five everybody around me. Like, people I don't even know will get high fives. So that's all fine. So there's a gradient between those two.
100%. Yep. It's a spectrum. And I will say, like, anybody that assaulted a police officer on January 6th, I don't care what your politics are, you deserve to go to jail. If you pepper sprayed a cop or law enforcement or a badge person, man, I throw the book at it. The only
that being said, they've served enough time.
100%. And
so let them all out, and that would be fine too. And obviously Trump saw that, so good for him.
Well, and the only other problem with that is equal application of the law, because what we didn't see that during the George Floyd riots of 2020 there at the White House as well.
There was talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I would love to talk about that, because there was a ton of actual injuries. I don't think any officers were actually killed. I actually brought up the Wikipedia.
Injured, yes. Killed, no.
There was almost 200 officers injured, like multiples that were severely injured, and yet there were very few people that did jail time on that, and that's
none that I'm aware of.
Yeah, so, I'm just doing that to hedge my bet,
just in case. Yeah. So here's what it was so bad, and the number of resources that were available. First of all, there was all kinds of stupidity that happened in Washington, D.C. itself, where we were marching around doing what I don't know what else to call, but except presence patrols, wearing body armor and plaid shirts, like a bunch of tards. We're walking around and it makes no sense whatsoever. It looks stupid. We're wearing FBI body armor. This is where you got the NEAL Team 6 folks and the woman who was the commander, the MEAL Team 6 operator that you guys saw, the 300-pound female whose name is Sarah Linden, who's been promoted, by the way. She's actually a DAD right now, Deputy Assistant Director, which is a real problem, and hopefully not for long. But you got these people that were kneeling, they were subservient, they were basically enabling the BLM/Antifa. So I don't want to put them as the same people, because I don't think they are, but there's certainly an overlap between those two groups, and ideological sympathies are abounding. And so we went through the entire roster, and Secret Service, which is usually done by the uniform division that was defending the White House on the North Lawn there, got beaten so badly over a period of a couple of nights. They called in my so-called covert surveillance team in our so-called covert vessels. We were driving in like minivans and pickup trucks that had no license plates on them, because we pulled our plates off because we didn't want to get tagged. And we're standing there overtly in the vehicles that we use for surveillance on like dirtbags that are, just a couple blocks away. And we're sitting there doing the thing we had to do because they needed people on the line. So the day after they burned the church at St. John's, and we're rushing the White House lawn, me and my team were out there. In fact, there's famous pictures of my buddy. I don't want to say his name because he's still working, and he's actually working in a fairly sensitive position. But my buddies are standing out there having their pictures taken by Fox News. And we're the ones that are in the, literally, we're called a covert surveillance unit, that all we do is go after the sensitive, high-value targets and try to observe them in the United States. That's how deep the bench was depleted. And I also saw it happen in Portland. So I got sent out to Portland for 2 weeks in September of 2020. So all of these things, not only did they happen in this country, and a lot of people watched them on live streams, I watched them sitting in a car through the windshield and binoculars on a radio, listening to what the intel units were gathering in the field offices. And we were gathering FRS radio transmissions from Antifa units that were doing legitimate counter surveillance tactics. They were actually deploying security and confront security elements to go out there and try to scare off federal and state surveillance entities because they thought they could ID who they were. And they were a mixed bag. They got some of us and they got some other people that were not involved at all, but they were running people off overtly. And that's RICO stuff. Like, that's how you would go build a RICO case. You would show that there's organized crime, they're involved in racketeering, and they're also furthering federal crimes. You could run a RICO case out of Portland today, as far as I understand it, and we have all of those transmissions taped. We had all of the actors identified. We were following to their houses. We were seeing what vehicles they were running in. We knew the associations. We were following their live streams and their social media nonsense, and we'd unmasked all that, and nothing happened. And then they threw the book at people on January 6th for a riot that lasted for a couple of hours. So that discrepancy and that unequal application, that's always been the biggest problem that I had. It's like, look, we didn't seem to give a darn about what happened in Washington, D.C. when you had me walking around, wearing my duty gear like an idiot in the night. It's just, it didn't make any sense. They had HRT deployed to the freaking Hoover building. They were sitting there in case that the building got overrun. So you've got, some pretty capable operators that are in there, and they're pretty well jocked up.
During the George Floyd protests, right?
Correct. Yeah, they're just sitting there on their bags, like hanging out to defend the Hoover building because there's a lot of sensitive assets and information there. So that doesn't make any sense. And then you turn around and you have the quote unquote biggest case the FBI's ever worked, bigger than 9/11. That's embarrassing. And it should have been embarrassing for everybody that actually went after it full hog.
So it's funny watching the response from the FBI and people in the media, like Rachel Maddow. I was watching a few other people.
I love it.
And they're losing their mind about it. And they're sort of saying, oh, but if, he's put out this memo and these people have to explain the investigations they did. And I think it was Rachel Maddow. She said, that's basically almost all of them. Or it's like 3/4 of the FBI that's investigating this case. And I'm thinking, isn't that a problem? How is so many of the FBI investigating this one day, like an hour or two?
Here's the other thing. Look, you guys know the 80-20 rule. You know that in any operational unit, like 20% of the dudes are working the hardest and getting most of the work done, and they're getting 80%, and the rest of them are kind of like lagging for the other 20, or not at all. Maybe it's even worse, 90-10 in some units, I would imagine. The FBI is no different. So let's be generous and say 30% of the FBI agents. That's about 14,000 total. So 30% of them are actually building cases, and the rest of them are either doing support or they're doing administrative uselessness at headquarters or field offices.
Just doing their time.
You know what? You could lose 70% of the FBI agents and you would still have a functional group of people that are prosecuting cases, that are building them to AUSAs, that are out there dismantling drug organizations and keeping an eye on terrorists and doing all the things that need to be done. Rachel Maddow has no idea what she's talking about. The highest numbers I've seen is maybe 6,000 people were any degree of association with these cases. The surveys that we've seen being leaked out of the Bureau right now say that they're only targeting and they're only interested in a hierarchy, as you'd expect. The supervisors are much more problematic than the people that were the line agents. And the only line agents that they're only interested in grabbing names and putting them into the small list are people that brought cases to prosecution. And then hopefully they look at them and say, okay, was there violence involved? Throw that out because that's a good prosecution. And if there's no violence involved and you're just making up stuff, that seems problematic. That means that you bought a narrative and you should know better. Like, you have discretion. My buddy told me that the biggest power you have as an FBI agent is to say no. Nobody uses it, by the way, except me, apparently, and a couple of guys I know. But like, that should be your biggest power, is when someone tells you to do something illegal, immoral, or unethical, you say no. And by the way, my public whistleblowing was not the first time that I said stuff like that. I brought it up whenever it was the case. It's like, this is not what I signed up to do. I also know it's not what you signed up to do. So no, that's not that hard. And nobody loses their job. Nobody loses their job over that until recently.
Well, going back,
the media is making it. You go.
Going back to the summer of love that we have there, where we didn't see prosecutions during that time, when you have assault on law enforcement, what was the word in the Bureau as to why they were not bringing forth prosecutions? I'd love this justification for that.
Yeah, it's really spicy. It's the worst example of anything that I remember. So I flew out to Portland, like I said, late September 2022. My team gets out there. They've got 6 other SOG teams from all around the country. We're all brought into like a big garage, space, and they're briefing us. And this was the following briefing. Antifa is an idea. This is Portland. We love our political activists and we love our First Amendment out here. And so we want to encourage people to engage in the process. And when I asked specifically, if Antifa's idea, then why have you dragged me away from my wife and my kids to come out here and help your field office do surveillance on them? Because that seems reasonable. They said, look, we can't be doing this stuff and we can't be running prosecutions because we have to live here when it's all said and done. And that is absolutely the worst reason that you could ever have, because every local law enforcement officer and every gang unit detective and every narcotics officer that's ever worked has to go back and live close enough to the community that they can commute into it. And they go dismantle bad guys every day. And if the FBI is scared of doing that work, they all need to hang up their cleats immediately. So when they told me that, I was like, this is absolute BS. There's zero reason you can justify this. But that's what we were told. And so, as a guy that's out there who's looking around, and I'm not dumb, I'm like, probably 38, 39, something like that. I've seen life. I've been on the paramedic side. I've seen things in the world. And I went, if I have to shoot one of these idiots that threatens me and puts me in a situation where I am basically in a deadly force scenario that I have no choice, this agency is going to hang me out to dry.
Yeah.
That is a terrible feeling. Yeah. And, it's like, well, do I need to carry like a drop gun? Do I need to start carrying like a knife so that I can get involved in this thing and throw it in the river? Like, what is I'm going to defend myself because I'm coming home. And I don't know what it's going to take, but like, are we really in a scenario where I work for the FBI and I know for a fact, and I can tell you, I felt very confident. We had multiple conversations on my team. What happens if one of us gets in the shooting? And the answer was, you're going to get screwed. That is not a way to operate. And that's why nobody was as aggressive as they wanted to be, because all the people that were decent, that were going to go out there and do the work, they knew that if they actually got challenged by these idiots who did have a lot of like LARPy tendencies. I mean, I watched them through night vision, like in the park, and it's like a bunch of Antifa idiots with wooden shields. I'm not even making that up. They had wood shields, and they would gather up and like they're doing like Ice Wizard, LARPy stuff in the corner. They go running at full speed against the riot police from the Portland Police Bureau, who are like huge. They're like 6'8", they're all like 350 pounds and like wake up early to do this stuff. They're really excited. They came in riding on a custom Suburban that had skids on it. So they're holding on to like handrails. There's like 8 of them on each side of the Suburban, popped the curb, drove into the middle of this big field full of trees, and then deployed like 16 riot troops that went out there and just smashed the hell out of these idiots that were running at them full speed. And when these kids got knocked to the ground, they started screaming, retreat, retreat, and they ran back into the neighborhood. And then they formed up and they ran back in and got hit by the cops again. So I'm watching this stuff and you're like, this is stupid. Like everything here is the dumbest thing that could be happening. This is not serious people that are looking to arrest them. I'm not even, and the Portland PD had already been chastised. So all they could do was like knock them over a couple times when they were doing it defensively. And everything about that was the opposite of what we saw on January 6th. That's why people, I think, got so enraged. We watched something happen. We watched the outcome be that they basically deposed Donald Trump in a way that looked very sketchy, and nobody investigated the election fraud. They didn't do it. We were asking the questions in my field office in Washington, D.C. Hey, we see some pretty credible allegations. There's some footage. What's going on there? What are we doing to, ensure that there was a secure election? And the answer was essentially shut up and color. And we're only interested in one kind of thing: voter suppression. We do not care about election fraud in the FBI. And they proved that for the last 4 years. Yeah. So that's crazy level shenanigans. And then you know that your agency's not going to back you up. So like, what do you do? Like, you just see people phoning it in.
Well, that's a topic I didn't even plan on getting into, but I would like to a little bit, because, my biggest thing with voter fraud is the way and I want to hear your thoughts on this, if you agree on my assessment on this, but the way that our system is set up, it's very easy to pull off voter fraud, but it's very difficult to prove. And it's really harder to even prove if you have 0 people out there investigating it, which is what I saw during the 2020 election. There was 0 interest. There was, whether it was the media or whether it was any law enforcement agency, there was nobody curious about whether or not there was actual voter fraud. What's your take on it?
I'm a skeptic. Like that's just the way I work at it. I was a paramedic. If people tell me something, I assume they're lying. I look for the symptoms to tell me otherwise. Like when you're out there in the world, if somebody tells you things that you want to believe, you should start from the opposite and try to disprove it. The problem with looking at that election is that there were some serious numerical anomalies that were very, very odd. Now, whether it was simply because they had just allowed mass mail-in voting, it had never happened before, maybe that's the case. Maybe it was the mass counting and the fact that they're all electronic at this point, and we've basically given up all of our elections into a black box that goes into a computer program that we can't see. And I've read all the stuff, or at least I've read the stories about it. I haven't looked into code because I don't care that much, to be fair. And like my interest level's not there, but I have friends that are absolutely convinced that they were vote switched, that they were remote access terminals. And all of those sound, the one thing that is really important, they sound credible. The FBI has a very, very capable cyber program. They have very capable cyber exploitation guys. They have things that are called CART, which is the computer side, and CAST, which is the cell phone side. And these types of teams can go through and do a lot of technology analysis domestically. And they've got a lot of budget, and they've been doing it for a while, and that didn't get done. So the complete lack of appetite as you said, to go out there and pursue the answers. This is what should have happened. Let's say that it was legitimate, because I don't know that it wasn't, but it just doesn't look like it from me. Imagine if it was. What would you want everybody to go, look, this was a legit election. Everything was done by the book. We know for a fact that all the local precincts reported properly. So we welcome in an FBI investigation to do a secure audit. They're going to come in here and validate what we've already said, and we have nothing to hide. And if that's not the case, why don't you want that to be the case? Because that's really weird. And it's weird to say, it's not good to say, like, people who don't have something to hide are more forthcoming, because I'm not a forthcoming guy, and neither are you. I'm sure of it. Like, I'm sure both of you guys value your privacy.
I hate that friggin', well, if you got nothing to hide, well, because I have a constitutional right, jackass.
Correct. But the government has no rights. It has no rights. The people have rights. And so because we as people, the American people, have rights, go read the Bill of Rights. None of them are for government except for state and local governments. Yeah. So why did we not go forward and have these evaluated? And because they didn't do it, all it did was leave an asterisk on that forever for me. There's no other way to look at it. It's an asterisk election. And at the end, I also think that it plays into God's plan. Whatever my life looks like, it looks like it's better now than it would have been if Donald Trump had won two in a row. So I'm okay with it. But man, it's been a rough 4 years for most of us.
Well, and the problem is you talked about part A. Hey, you know what? We want to make sure, not even really we want to make sure, we got all the assurances from all the leaders, right? Oh, our elections are secure. They're this, they're that. Everything's
the most secure ever, that one.
Yes, that's right. That's pretty superlative.
But we are not going to look into it because, well, we already know. Like,
how dare you?
Yeah, like it was absolutely.
Yeah, and this case doesn't have standing, so therefore the judges have ruled that there was nothing wrong.
Right. Well, that's conflation too. So we've seen a lot of that as well, where people are saying things that are not said. Look, you got to go back and read decisions if you want to say things about it. The American people, to their detriment, have a very short attention span, and some of that has been weaponized, because it's like you could tell people actually factually true information, including things like none of the claims were ever evaluated in court because they were ruled not to have standing. And they're like, oh, well, they don't know what that means because they have never paid attention to what lawfare looks like. And it's not been part of their life. The minute it starts affecting them personally, people suddenly become, the same sort of, the jailhouse attorney or the barracks attorney that everybody wants to be, where they actually start looking into it and they start knowing things. But until that actually hits you in the face, most people are totally happy to go to work, earn a paycheck, not look at the politics. I have friends that have been my friend my whole life, and they don't know seriously what happened to me. My siblings don't know what I trained to do when I was in the military. They have no idea what I did when I was in the FBI, and they're not really sure why I wasn't there, but they kind of suspect it was probably my fault because, we probably got into disagreements when we were teenagers. Like, that's the kind of thing that just goes on. They're like, yeah, but weren't you kind of a turd? And it's like, yeah, I was a turd because I believe in the Constitution. That's crazy, but it's true. So we're just in a sad time when a lot of things can be pulled over. That's why information ops are successful. You have to have a bunch of basically low information folks that feel very strongly and passionately that something is wrong. And I think that after the sort of the COVID chaos, and we don't even have to get into what went on there to be saying that the outcome of it is very obvious to me. People had two choices in life when they came out of the COVID, awakening. You could say everything is being told to me is a lie, and therefore I am going to be very cautious about what comes my way, and I'm going to doubt all things. I'm going to doubt institutions, and credibility has to be proven, and so on. Just trust me, bro's no good. And the other people said everything they told me was a lie, so whatever I believe is just as good as their lie. So I'm just going to believe anything I want. And that's where you get like flat earthers out there and a bunch of other wild stuff, like the moon is made out of cheese. And so suddenly we have people that are just living on another planet. And now we don't even have an agree upon, like, how do we even evaluate facts? Because what I believe is good enough. And so a lot of people chose that road because it's easy. It's really hard to have conversations with those people. And it's really hard to have a country and consensus if we want to actually do things rationally. Because I get these people that were yelling at me about Q earlier today. Like, I literally today on X. And I'm like, that was always an information op. That kept you from doing the thing that you wanted to do, which was complain about the legitimate problem. Trust the plan is not a plan. Anybody who's ever been in any plan knows that.
I had people close to me that were 100% convinced. And I did at the time, I was a little naive. I didn't know what this Q thing was, but I kept hearing all the rumblings that ultimately I found out later were these rumors and these things coming from Q, like, JFK Jr. is going to suddenly appear on one day. And like, I had people like telling me like, yeah, man, I'm telling you this date.
And not dumb people.
No, not dumb people at all.
That's like, the key.
Like, what? And yeah, you see how effective these IO campaigns absolutely can be. They are, and they're being done. And those are the areas, I generally don't believe in conspiracies, but I also believe that conspiracies absolutely do happen. I think people don't often look at them where they're actually taking place. But with all that said, here's the question of the day, I guess, because we can go down so many different rabbit holes. Before we get into allowing comments and questions from the audience here, the question is, what can be done with the FBI? How effective do you think Trump is going to be at cleaning up the FBI? And is this just a 4-year Band-Aid? Is after 4 years, we're going to go back to the status quo? Is all these people that potentially will be fired? We'll see if that actually takes place. I think it will. But will this be re-bastardized here in another 4 to 6, 8 years? And we're going to be right back where we are, 5, 6, 10 years from now. What's your thoughts on that, Kyle?
That's certainly possible. So there's at least a possibility and maybe even the probability. I think the status quo is sort of the default position for anything that happens in Washington. So maintaining that, there's a lot of energy that moves that direction. So that's part one. What needs to happen is, if you'd asked me this a year ago, I used to say just destroy the whole damn thing.
Yeah.
And I don't hate that idea. And I still don't. It just doesn't. There's nothing that should be sacred inside our government that you can't get rid of it outside of the things that are outlined in the Constitution. The lower courts, negotiable. Like law enforcement agencies, negotiable. Tax, negotiable. All of it. So all those things, for me, if you took them or left them,
turning FBI buildings into museums, that's
totally fine with it. It's not a very nice building. Like, I've spent time there. They got a weird outdoor gym that's kind of funky on the second floor. They got a courtyard that doesn't make sense. It's not a good building. We used to joke that you could sneak in at night and paint like one of the halls. Every night you could paint a hall a different color and like nobody would notice because they're just mopey and like looking down at their feet when they walk, because it's just a depressing place. It's built in the brutalist style that was built in the 70s. It's just ugly. It's an ugly ass building. But the culture is the rot. That's the problem. So you're working against the status quo, which is a culture. So imagine that the top of the FBI are a bunch of people and they've just moved some people in there and it's definitely shaking things up. But all the folks that are senior management and all the people that are going to draw and be pulled into senior management from the GS-15, GS-14 level and above, these are all your supervisors, second level supervisors, and so on. All of these things, the danger is that that's who the management culture is. And they all said yes to all these ideas. They all agreed to it. They all raised their hand and said, yeah, I want to do the work. What needs to happen is probably a complete hourglass model where you take the bottom that has the most sand and flip it upside down. You need the best case agents who have been very reluctant to go out there and take a managerial position because they don't want to move to DC or they don't want to uproot their family. Give them an opportunity to work remotely as a manager of a program. Give them the opportunity to be a senior administrator and do the work that needs to be done because they understand how the damn work has been done for the last 15, 18 years. You got to take your supervisors that never wanted to leave a desk, that only wanted to supervise squads doing work. And you're going to have to ask them nicely and promote them into places and probably accommodate them so they don't have to screw up their family life and everything else. And they definitely have to decentralize. I think there's a real movement to do it. I think what we've seen is the first steps that really have thrown a lot of blood on the floor and the walls. And the do nothing nature of the FBI is running absolutely terrified. We get nonstop messages. Here's the funny thing, though. My buddies who are agents that do the work that people think FBI agents do, locking up bad guys, yeah, they are laughing their asses off. They don't give two rats if they actually shut the whole agency down. They think it's funny because they're great investigators and they'll be great wherever they go. They could work for another agency. They could go to state. They could go local. They could go start a business or consulting. None of them are scared because their work ethic and their record is capable. The crappy managers, who are the mid-level sort of like bureaucracy that exist, they all suck and they're all terrified. They don't know what's going to happen. How are they going to get to retirement? The entire purpose of their job was to pay them, not to do a mission for the American people. And so that attitude has to change. And this is interesting. A lot of people don't know this, and I share this with Kash Patel personally. Between September 4th and September 7th of 2020, the FBI changed its mission statement and moved the number one mission, which used to be rigorous obedience to the Constitution of the United States of America. That was number one when I came in. And in 2020, in that September little window, in 3 days, the outfacing to the American people website said that they changed it to number 8. And the things like respect and compassion and diversity were all more important than rigorous obedience to the Constitution of the United States of America. That's a real thing. When you tell people what your mission statement is, you should probably believe the FBI. And so they've got to get back to that rigorous, attitude where I used to tell people that I was an FBI agent. I used to joke about it. I'd tell them I was a secret agent because everything I worked on said secret. And they'd be like, don't you mean a special agent? And I'm like, no, man, everything I do is lame. It all says secret and I can't do anything with it. And so, I would just joke about it because I was in Washington, D.C. and there are no, overtly secret agents. Every job I did was obviously very open and it was publicly acknowledged. But that attitude of like, I'm a secret agent is real in the FBI. You've seen it when people won't show their credentials. They won't say their name. It's because they know what they're doing is wrong. I never had a problem handing a business card. I never had a problem telling people my full name. I never had a problem giving the phone number to my work cell phone because that's why I had it. Its purpose was to take phone calls from the public. So it's really easy. It's like, hey, yeah, this is my work cell phone. It's always on. If you need me, call me. You'd get people calling you that were obnoxious and you have to deal with it. But that's what you signed up for. And if you didn't, get the hell out. So moving into what I would call like a servant leadership role and letting people actually get back to doing the work that is expected. And that it's going to take a long time. It's going to take an entire generation of FBI agents to bring back any amount of respect for that agency. Because I don't have it. My kids think the FBI is the enemy. I had to sell my house. We had to move in with my parents at 41 years old, which is not a very cool thing to do for anybody. And I had a pregnant wife and 3 kids, and that sucked. And so I hate them pretty aggressively. And then the other thing is people always want to know, would you go back and work for them? And the answer is I don't want to. I got betrayed by that agency, but I'll do it because I believe in the oath and I kind of want to close the arc. If there's a way that I could fix it with a specific mission, I would help. But I'm not sure they need me. What they need is a guy like Kash Patel, and he's fantastic. He really is. I mean, I know the guy personally, and he's honorable. He's honest. He will do what he says he will do, and they're executing a plan right now that is not Kash doing it. But man, it looks like a really good step of a hostile takeover and a counterinsurgency all at once. This is the business model is the hostile takeover. The counterinsurgency is they're trying to win hearts and minds of the people that actually want to do the work. So they're off to a good start. I'm optimistic, but there's a lot of work to be done there. And there's a massive culture that has to be ripped out.
Yeah. I think, when you're talking about, I don't care if you're talking about special operations or you're talking about career FBI agents that are of that 20-30% that are actually getting the work done. Your career is your identity. If not, you're probably that other 70%. And on top of that, if you fall out of love with that organization, whatever that is, it's time to move on. And I think that's exactly what is taking place with a lot of people. And I know a lot of people are getting out of federal service. Again, I know a lot of FBI agents, Secret Service agents, diplomatic security agents, and you're seeing an exodus. And we've been seeing this for a really long time, where people that have a conscience, that believe in the Constitution. I am curious. I don't know if we covered this specifically, but I know we kind of touched on it. In the culture of the FBI, was there something put out that was hey, we are accountable to the Constitution? Because the way that it's appeared to me from the leaders I've seen in the FBI, there is a tangible, palpable contempt to be held accountable and for the idea that they are accountable to the American people. That's what I feel.
Yeah, you're correct.
What is the culture, or when you were there, what was the culture as far as that? Hey, we're violating people's rights right now. We're doing surveillance on people that we don't have a warrant. We're violating their Fourth Amendment rights. What was those discussions like? Yeah,
a lot of times, basically, they act like you were just born when you went to the academy. Even I went there at 35 and I had a whole life before me. And they act like you just got hatched on the world. I had a boss actually who told me this was the dumbest thing I've ever heard. I spent years in outside business sales. I sold $20 million worth of computers. I did finance and accruals of multi-million-dollar assets for Warner Brothers. I'm sitting at my desk. I'm brand new at the bureau as a 36-year-old now. And my boss walks up and she was like, I said something like, I just saw this guy do this crazy thing out on the street. And she was like, oh my God, you're going to see so many crazy things in this job. When you start getting out there in the world and meeting people, you'll just see some stuff. And I'm like, lady, I worked in an ambulance and I worked in a freaking, emergency room for 2 years. I've seen I've pulled the craziest thing out of people's butts. What are you talking about? Like, I've had guys come in that have, just sat on this thing, and you're like, what? She just acted like I've never seen a human being before, and she was about to tell me about the world. So these things happen. I mean, what happens in the team room is the team room thing. So, but what I'm getting at is that it's real wild to imagine that, they just don't think they're accountable, and they don't want to take anybody's experience as a former law enforcement officer who says, hey man, maybe we should pump the brakes on this. Like, the Fourth Amendment is a problem. We should probably go get a warrant, or we could get a warrant. Or why wouldn't we get a warrant if we're working around it? That attitude doesn't exist. It's my buddy Rob Green calls it institution over constitution. The DOD's done the same thing. When you honor the place that you work over the reason that you work there, that's the major issue. And so, a lot of people have identified this problem of, I failed to do the mission because the mission's not important. Like, I'm important, and the place that I work and the reputation of it. FBI agents come out and they want you to think the FBI was the greatest place ever. And there's a big break in retired FBI agents. Some of them won't tell anybody they work there anymore. They're embarrassed. They're ashamed, and with good reason. Maybe the work they did was honorable, but it's not an honorable place the way they look at it, and they don't want anyone to know that they were there. As my buddy Phil used to say, it starts off as a passion and it often becomes a paycheck. And so these are kind of like taglines, but they're real for people who are living it. I had a guy that spent 27 years as an FBI agent. Okay. He's actually the guy that exposed that the FBI was looking into Catholics in Richmond, Virginia. He gave me information that I got to Congress on his behalf. 27 years before he brought that to me, he told me that he got up in the morning, put on his badge and his gun every day, looked himself in the mirror, and he was ashamed of working for that agency. That is a horrible thing to do to somebody who spent 20-something years of their life doing it. And then at the end of it, you know how they thanked him? They marched him out like a criminal, and they threw all of his shit in the front yard. They took all of his stuff out of his office that he'd been in for 11 years as a supervisor and threw it in his front yard because he had exposed the FBI corruption going after Catholics, because they were interested in white supremacy at Latin masses. And they didn't ever go out there and say, hey, wait, are we to blame? Because maybe we shouldn't be recruiting like people in a church as sources without any real predicated, investigations. And so that attitude is awful, and it's pervasive. And on top of it, it's like, if you embarrass the fraternity, you're the problem. That's the real thing that you see a lot of it. And there's guys that have that probably attitude in every organization. If it starts off with prestige and high speed, and if you embarrass the badge, if you embarrass the patch, if you embarrass the tab, whatever it may be, like, you're the problem. Forget the fact that you're calling out real wrongdoing. And that's an enemy. I don't know how you do that. That's human nature, I think, in some ways, to kind of like cling to organization instead of like principles.
Yeah, no, I mean, we're all tribal at the end of the day, and that's part of the problem is when you disassociate the tribe of the United States citizen and the Constitution, and now what my tribe is this organization that, I can sit here and pretend it's prestigious, I'm important, this institution's important, and the Constitution and people's rights be damned. I mean, that's what comes down to it. Mm-hmm. All right. Folks, I'm going to go through and we'll start hitting some of your questions. I'm going to go back. We'll do a little recap because there's some questions from some of the topics we covered before. But question from Brian. Question for Kyle. I, for one, appreciate and respect you coming forward and blowing the whistle on the corrupt brass at FBI. My question is, what was the beef with Julie Kelly about? Are you friends now? I don't know who this is, so sorry if I'm putting you on the spot.
No, it's okay. That's fine. It was a big situation on Twitter. So Julie Kelly is a big Democrat donor. Her husband is a lobbyist. He's either the highest or the second highest paid lobbyist in the state of Illinois. And they've donated to Democrats like upwards of close to $200,000 in the last 20 years. So not a ton of money, but more money than most people do. My beef with Julie Kelly was that she stated something that was empirically false, that was absolutely stupid and actually kind of dangerous, because I thought it was going to whip up a lot of MAGA people into a frenzy, which it actually did. She stated that because the FBI included what's called the deadly force policy on the operations order going into Mar-a-Lago for the search warrant, that they were trying to kill Donald Trump, that they basically, quote unquote, authorized deadly force. But federal agents, anybody who carries a gun for the federal government is always authorized to use deadly force as long as it's within their policy. And the FBI's deadly force policy is actually pre-written on the op order. There's no way to take it off. It's the only way to do an op. So Julie and I kind of disagreed about two things. She wanted to get a bunch of clicks 2 years after the Mar-a-Lago raid because she was trying to get excited and get people whipped up about Donald Trump, which is fine. It's just not smart when people are actually kind of volatile. I'm more interested in saying that the raid should have never happened. There should have never been a search warrant. This was a paperwork dispute between a former POTUS and a government agency, and it could have been resolved without the FBI getting involved. I'm ashamed of everybody that went on that raid, and they shouldn't have been there. And I've got friends that went on it, and they don't talk to me anymore because of the things I've said about what they did. I think it was dishonorable to go in and serve that search warrant. So I think they should have said no. So the beef was that. Then I just published the fact that she was a big Democrat donor, and meanwhile she's making a bunch of money off MAGA people. It's kind of interesting. She wrote a pro-Trump book while she was actually donating to Biden. So like, I don't know what that's all about. Like, you know, she's got to answer her own questions. It's probably because her husband was doing it in her name. Maybe she really believes what she says, but she's kind of a rotten person. She came in, she threatened me privately, which is funny. When a 50-something-year-old like 5'9" housewife who's a multimillionaire tells you like F around and find out, and I'm like, I've got more guns than you have friends. I don't know what you're talking about, but I like my cave is full, and my neighbors are not
guns too.
Yeah, it's like I live in Texas, America. You live in freaking not America. You live in Illinois. So my beef with Julie Kelly was just that. I'm not friends with her right now. She can apologize anytime she wants. I was a source for a lot of her information for a while, and I was a fact check because she regularly doesn't know what she's talking about. She also was like a shill for Monsanto and a couple of other like big ag and big food things who just happened to pay her husband like millions of dollars in lobbying fees. You know, I don't think she's an honest operator. That's just my take on it. People can think whatever they want. People get really excited about like hero worship because people build themselves well and they have a big following on social media.
Well, and for those of you that haven't spent time in DC or like, you don't understand how many of these people are just all over the place, right? Like they're friends with the Democrat side. They're not ideological. That's the thing. What they're there for is money. And
she probably makes $500,000 a year between Twitter and her Substack writing like things that are not accurate. She essentially has access to like federal courts. She claimed that she was at every J6 trial. She went to like 2 or 3 of them. I had friends that were at almost all of them. She wasn't at any of them there. So, you know, she misrepresented herself. I think she's a fraudulent actor. Is she a force for evil in the world? Probably not. Like she's just not important to me in my life, and hopefully she doesn't ever try to threaten me physically. She actually threatened one of my buddies, which is really funny because he's not a very aggressive dude. Like, if you're 5'9" and like in your 50s and you're a lady, like don't threaten grown men with beards. That's a weird thing to do. It's just not a good choice.
Did she respond to you talking about the Democrat funding?
Never. She's never once addressed the Democrat funding. This is the funniest part about all of it, because I'm told there's basically 2 possibilities. Either she's a Democrat and that's what she believes. I don't actually think that's probably true. Or more likely, her husband has committed felonies by doing straw donations, which are felonies, and he probably shouldn't have done that. So if she says that, she's outing the breadwinner of her family who makes like millions of dollars a year. She makes probably $500,000 on her little journalistic ploy.
She just sounds
Sorry, what are straw donations? Pardon the ignorance.
Straw donations are if somebody donates in your name and you didn't approve them. So it's problematic if she represents herself to be a Republican and all she does is Democrat donations. But if someone donates in your name, if it's your husband and you never out him, then you know you basically have to own those donations. She's basically between a rock and a hard place. She can't own the donations, or she's going to have to basically say that she's a Democrat. And if she doesn't, you know, if she outs her husband for doing it, then he's a felon. So she's in a bad spot. That's why she just ignored me and she just calls me a Fed, which is dumb.
All right.
It's outdated, actually. Yeah.
Why did the FBI clarify find people on both sides? Charlottesville lie. I mean, I think I'll let
why
you
did or why did they not? It's not the FBI's job to go out there and correct the media. That was a media op. That was always a media hit job. And I think we can kind of agree on that. So, you know, the FBI doesn't fact check the president. They really didn't have a role in that. I understand that it was dumb. And I think those of us that are honest operators can agree. But, you know, the media, there's no FBI role there.
Yeah, it's not their job to fact check the media either. And that's honestly the last thing that we want them doing, to be honest with you.
Oh, 100%. I don't want that at all.
Why after a bad event does the FBI almost always say the subject was on its radar? Why can't they arrest them before they take action?
It's a good question, actually. That's a really good question. So that's one of the biggest questions people always ask. Number one, there is no radar. It's not such a thing. So there's a thing called NTALC. It's the National Tactical Operations Center. That's what happens if you call 1-800-FBI TIPS. You get, or FBI tip, I think. You end up with somebody who's working in West Virginia. They're in Martinsburg, and they're out of CGIS. All right. So that phone call equals there's going to be something generated about the person that you call about. Now, they get hundreds, if not thousands of calls a day, depending on what the ops tempo looks like. And all of these things are everything from, you know, my neighbor's a jerk and he mows his lawn late at night, and I think that because of that, he's probably a terrorist. You know, all the dumbest things you can imagine get called in there. people with a lot of mental illness make these calls, and then people that have beef that they want to go and vendettas, and people that are calling the wrong thing. There's a couple reasons why the FBI doesn't act on these things and why you don't want them to. In fact, you want the most limited operation of the FBI. You don't want it to be doing random, operations based on phone calls coming in from anonymous tipsters. One of them is because they're not federal crimes. So a lot of stuff like what happened at Parkland, for example, the shooting that went on down there, like a mass shooting of a school is not expressly a federal crime unless they are doing it in furtherance of a terrorist ideology, and that's pretty explicit and predicated. It is not. It's a local problem. And so they should refer it to local police, but oftentimes those things can slip through if they can't validate it. And there's only so many people that can handle this kind of intake. And then the second thing is that, like, let's say they went out there and Omar Mateen, for example, and they investigated the guy and he hasn't committed a federal crime. How long do you want an intel investigation or a counterterrorism investigation into somebody? How long should it last? There's a finite amount of resources. If they've investigated and determined that this person has, one, not committed a crime, two, is not likely to in the near future, they could change their mind tomorrow. But you can't leave indefinite operations open and investigations into Americans, because in theory, we should be able to be beholden to the Bill of Rights. So you actually want them not to do as much as they do. Oftentimes, It looks really bad. So they're constantly playing this game of, is this person likely to embarrass us in the future? Or are we going to be infringing on their civil liberties? And that's a balancing act, and it's not an easy thing to do. Don't put me in the position of apologizing for the FBI, but in that situation, the honest operator has to say it's a gray area, and there's never a right answer. And so you're always going to get things that slip through.
The most egregious violations of the Constitution and human rights in U.S. history are always done in the idea of crime prevention or prevention in general. And that's not what 100%. We want. We have these organizations that once a crime is committed, they're there to investigate and prosecute said criminal. What we don't want is, this agency that's out there to investigate and find crimes. That's not what we want. So, and that's why my other podcast is called Dangerous Liberty. Liberty's dangerous, man. Freedom's dangerous, and that's what we want. The only thing that's more dangerous than liberty is the lack thereof.
Yeah, my buddy Steve Prince says America is an action verb. You can add that into your lexicon. If you want to have America, you want to do America. And that means you have to actually exercise that freedom. And you take on risk when you have freedom. So you're exactly right with your Dangerous Liberty title.
AM says assassination attempts. Ooh, this is a rabbit hole. Can you tell us about either the alleged assassins and possible connection to a 3-letter agency? What can you not tell us about Ruth and Crooks?
All right, so I don't have any special information other than I think there's something that a lot of people, this is the rabbit hole of I want to believe certain things, so I'm going to go after it and I'm going to believe what I want. And I think maybe, well, you tell me what you think. I think there's a thing that's called the myth of competency. That's my term for it. But everyone assumes that there's an invisible force field around anybody that is protected by the Secret Service. And that's not true. I don't think a lot of people challenge the Secret Service because it's a good way to get dead. And so if that's the case, right? You just don't take that shot. How many credible threats have they stopped that were actually operational and brought, a weapon system within proximity to the president? I know we actually we disarmed a number of people on Donald Trump's first inauguration, but they never got anywhere close. They got stopped at a perimeter or they abandoned them in a subway train. They just didn't bring a knife or a gun into the space that was going to get them close enough to do anything. And so I don't think a lot of people get close. I also think there's a home game and an away game attitude, that the home game, you're way better. In DC, like the Secret Service is aces all the time. They know all the windows, they know all the angles, they know the windage, they know where the flags are. They can call, distances by eyeball because that's their home field. But if you take them to a field in the middle of Pennsylvania somewhere, or you take them down to a golf course they haven't been to in a long time down in Florida, the game changes. Now, does it mean, the first guy I think was probably very organic, very, very troubled, and probably spent the last 12 years of his life, which is basically his entire adult or conscious time. He was getting radicalized by a media cycle that said this guy is literally Hitler. He is going to destroy America, and he is coming to kill off anybody that is like you. Agreed. We heard that nonstop if you were on the left.
And probably his parents saying the same thing, by the way.
Very likely. So I don't see as much of a problem. I'm terrified that he got so close. Again, that overlapping number of somebody talked about the failure of the aviation that happened with the Black Hawk being like Swiss cheese lining up and having a hole that goes perfectly through a bunch of random holes. You had a lot of failures on that day. But some of them, that myth of competency, people have no idea how bad government comms are and how bad federal agents are about using radios, which I have a lot of experience seeing bad. So
more interagency coordination and communication. That's part of it. I think there was some elitism on the side of the Secret Service. And the reality is that
yes,
I actually went to the second Trump rally. I went and did investigations right after the attempt. Folks, the amount of assets they had on the ground, there was absolutely no way to secure that area. And it's not just that time. Look, there could have been a successful attempt on Trump's life at almost every single rally prior to that. There just wasn't somebody there that was willing to do it and didn't take advantage of the opportunities. I 100% believe that to be the case. And unfortunately, there was very obvious lapses in security in that situation. We had somebody that was willing, that exploited those lapses in security. But, we talk about that one building. He could have taken those shots. I mean, somebody could have drove a car through there. There's 1,000 things that could have led to a successful attempt or an actual successful assassination of Donald Trump. And what we got is what we got. And I completely agree with you. I think.
Yeah. I mean, he decided he was ready to cash that check. It's a one-way ticket to go do that stuff. I mean, even with an unprepared security element, you're going to get a response and they're going to probably kill you. So somebody deciding to cash their check doing that particular action. And again, the fact that he got a chip shot inside 150 yards is wild to me. I also think he probably had a bad zero. That's just been my take looking at it. I think that dude probably had a bad zero, had like minimal training, but plenty of time pulling the trigger because he got him off quickly. Yep. But I think that the closest shot he had was probably when he realized that he was not even close and he was trying to basically do Kentucky windage and walk in a bad zero on his sights. Because there's no way you miss a dot at 150 yards. Man, I could do that with my pistol.
Yeah.
So, anyway, he wasn't an accomplished shooter and people were acting like that was some kind of like magic. I think the magic is that the man lived and that it nicked his ear. And there are a lot of reasons to see God in that day. And I think a lot of people, including Donald Trump, saw that there was a higher purpose, because that would have taken us to an unrecognizable place in America. That would not have been a recoverable spiral that we would have tipped into. And I'm so thankful that the fact that we don't talk about it every day is pretty wild, actually.
Yeah. So, and then for everybody else that thinks, there was some deep state conspiracy with multiple shooters and all this other stuff.
No, it's nonsense.
Then why wasn't it successful? That was an easy shot. Let me tell you something. You average sniper trained, we teach long range, do that all the stuff. Like, I would never miss that shot. Most shooters wouldn't miss that shot. If it was some deep state conspiracy, especially if you want to go with the idea that there was multiple shooters, which is just ridiculous at this point.
You're exactly correct, and the reason why you don't need to have multiples because it wasn't successful. If there was go back to the Kennedy situation, and the reason why people had all the theories they did is because the guy that they caught for the shooter ended up dead, and that guy ended up dead too, and everybody got tied up in a nice bow, and that looks really operational. That seems like a really clean move. So all of that was always suspicious because you don't usually have a situation where dead men tell no tales. In this case, a kid took a shot. He didn't get successful. There was no backup to solve the problem, which they were trying to solve, and he got offed. And, basically we watched somebody flinch, pull their head off the glass, and then we watched a professional put it down at 400 something yards. And that's not a crazy shot by any means. That's what you train for. That's like well within the operational envelope for what you got to get done. I don't need to have any more questions. I got some questions about what happened in Florida. I think that was a little bit weirder. That guy has way more, whether he was working on behalf of an intelligence agency or whether he's simply just been approached multiple times. You don't fly back and forth to Ukraine and not have a permanent address and operate around North Carolina and go back to Hawaii and back and forth. And like, you're moving way too much for a guy that's got no job, that is basically a functional weirdo and ends up standing up with like ceramic tiles. Like, you got mental illness and it looks like someone may have exploited that. But whether he was planted there by his own bad ideas, which is probably the most likely, it's the simplest, whether somebody planted that idea in his head and helped kind of push him along, but he ended up doing his own version of a really bad plan. I'm glad it didn't happen there earlier, as well. I'm kind of weirded out that a Secret Service agent was 5 feet away and was not able to dump that mag into the person, because it does seem like that was a heads up move to take the shot, but a weak situation to be defeated by chain link. But that wouldn't be the first law enforcement officer defeated by a chain link fence between them and a subject,
or miss a threat at 5 or less yards. Like that happens all the time.
Yeah, it does happen all the time, which people can't believe, but they've never seen what happens when the sympathetic nervous system dumps and
Yeah.
just how little, like, I always tell people that they're always like, yeah, I'm just going to see my front sight and squeeze. And I'm like, you're not going to see anything, dude. Have you ever interviewed somebody that's taken a shot like the first time? Like, they don't know what's going on. You know, the first time that you have somebody work a code in the medical field, they don't know what they did. That's why there's someone who writes it down. They were just pumping and moving, and, you know, and people are dying or not dying. It gets wild when you start having adrenaline dump into the game.
And that goes back to Crooks too. I mean, it was an easy shot, and he probably had a lot of adrenaline dump. You know, I mean, he was stressed. He knew that he was pretty
The
much,
cop climbed up like 20 seconds before or whatever it was.
yeah.
Yep.
And, you know, he would have seen that. He would have heard people probably yelling out, there he is, he's on the roof. He knows his time's limited. It's probably pretty stressful. And
100%.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, going back to, if there's a conspiracy with Crooks, the conspiracy is that I do think there was likely, and this is talking to Secret Service folks, I do think there was likely an intentional reservation of and denial of resources, whether it was because they just didn't like Trump, or that, you know, somebody thought, hey, you know what, because it's pretty easy, you know, you've done security assessments, vulnerability assessments.
Yeah, that is a terrible site survey. Everything about that, I agree with you 100% on this assessment as well.
And on top of that, well, I'm just saying, looking at Trump as a protectee, like, we need some assets, bro. Like, nobody likes Trump. That's a fact. I don't care if we're talking about foreign governments. I don't care if we're talking about radicals within our own country. Like, we needed more, and those resources were clearly denied. And what the intent was behind that, you can come to your own conclusion.
And,
now,
and it's easy to assume nefarious nature. So yeah, I have no problem with that assessment either. I mean, like, there's plenty of people in the government that do not like Donald Trump. I met Secret Service agents that didn't like him while they were protecting Donald Trump, you know, for State of the Union.
Sure.
So not common, certainly less common in a law enforcement world. There tends to be a lot more meat eaters and a lot more kind of like right-leaning people, but it's a thing, and people are allowed to have their own ideas. There's always like a hippie dude on every team somewhere.
Yeah. And then, you know, I also have questions about going back to it. Was there someone, whether it was a foreign government or anything else, that radicalized Crooks and aided and did Crooks? I think there could be a potential conspiracy there, but there was not a conspiracy there between Butler PD and Secret Service and people there on the ground. It was,
it does seem like Crooks would have been the right kind of vessel to radicalize into something, but acting alone is pretty straightforward. Like, now, how he decided to go do that, and, you know, what sort of bad ideas were being whispered in his head, I would not be shocked, and we're not going to get a lot of transparency unless Cash comes in and wants to open that up, in which case, great. I think he should. That'd be great.
And an argument against that, I'll tell you, like, Crooks was like the stereotypical school shooter. That's who he was. Like,
yep.
He just happened to not be in school, and he had another target at play. But, you know, that was that guy.
Oh yeah, this one's good.
I've still got a few questions on that. I'm still sort of researching and working on my documentary about that. I'm basically reading through all of the. I'm so far behind. I'm still on the Senate interviews with the Secret Service people from like months ago. I've read through maybe half of them, taking notes, and then I've got to go through. Then the House dumped a whole bunch more of interviews. So I'm trying to go through all that. But there are a couple of things. It's just I'm trying to work out how that building was supposed to be covered, because it definitely was identified as like a threat. It's very close, you know, sort of on multiple different occasions through multiple people from the Secret Service. They've sort of mentioned, we noticed in the planning, in the walkthrough, that was an issue, and we sort of have to cover that building. We've got to make sure people don't get on it. And then I'm trying to work out what went wrong there. Like, was there a miscommunication or something? Because it seems like the Secret Service, a few of them, like the lead agent, it's been a while. I'm a bit rusty with all this stuff. But
yeah, well, the sad
eventually
thing
I'll put
is
it all.
We don't have radio comms that were captured, because that would have been a big piece. If my memory serves, the most likely explanation for that roof was that they actually did have someone on there at one point in time, and that person either decided to take a window instead or moved and basically lost sight lines on the actual physical thing, which you can totally see happening in a government job. Like, that's just a normal thing that people do. They're like, man, it's hot as shit on this roof. I don't want to be up here anymore. I'm going to go sit inside. I can still see the same stuff, because they thought the area they were covering was something else, and they didn't realize their job was area denial of the roof itself. And look, that could happen by anybody that doesn't do security on a regular basis, that's not a professional. If they're a local PD, which is what it sounded like, it was a local PD coverage there, and then they stepped into a building and they went through an open window and they could still see out there. Look, you know, it's so easy to have a mistake like that be made. You don't need a big conspiracy. And like I said, it's that myth of competency, because you assume that you're dealing with nothing but professional, high-speed U.S. Secret Service, dedicated their life, will take a bullet for the president. And in reality, you've got like regular government employees, some of whom are awesome, some of them who are, you know, fully capable of sitting on glass for 13 hours and will do the same thing they would do overseas. And some of those guys are going to flinch when somebody starts popping off rounds at not them. So, either way, it's just, I just think that it was so much less of a big question other than where that kid came from or why he decided to do it, which we won't find out anymore.
And complacency is real, right? Whether you're the Secret Service detail or you're the local law enforcement element of that, they've done dozens, the Secret Service has done hundreds of those types of events, and nothing ever happens. And I think in their mind, the local law enforcement at the time that were in that building, like, yeah, we're in the building, it's covered. I can completely. I'm gonna peek my head out this window every now and then when I feel like, and the rest of the time I'm sitting there Facebooking it up over here. I think that's very real, and we've seen that. I've seen that on government. I've seen that on military operations. I've seen freaking, SOCOM guys that are high speed as shit. That they just got lazy on an op, and that's usually when bad things happen, or sometimes luckily not. But the fact is that everybody gets complacent, and I think that was just a major component of that whole situation.
Full agreement.
The thing that annoys me is that pretty much all the blame's going to the Secret Service, which I suppose is fair enough because it's their ultimate responsibility. But it does seem those ESU agents, they get given a pass. They don't get mentioned in the forget which report it is, either the Senate or the House report. They seem to go out of their way to sort of excuse the actions of the ESU like they did nothing wrong whatsoever, which I take an issue with because I think they did.
And so that's the reason why. You take responsibility when you own the site. If you have command of the site, if you're the one who runs the command post, if you're the one that have operational control over an operation, then it's your operation. And whatever happens underneath it, if you delegated to someone that found themselves inferior, it's your fault. I used to always say that when my guys would go out and do something. If I gave somebody a job they couldn't handle, you come back and you're like, hey, man, I blew it. Like, I blew it. I gave you the job, and I knew you couldn't tell east from west. So you called it out wrong, and we lost our subject. If that's something that happens, it's like it's on me, and I'll eat it. And that's the only way you can be if you're going to do real command structure, if you're going to have a real, chain of command and authorities that are delegated. When you delegate it, man, you own it. That's why people don't like to delegate.
Secret Service had 100% operational control of that environment, and it was their job to have somebody on, which also is SOP, their job to have people on the ground checking on local assets to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to do. Yes, the local guys.
Is that common practice? I was about to ask that. Is that how it usually happens in an event where you have the outer perimeter delegated to police, which I understand is common, but do the Secret Service
This is the home game, away game. So again, home game, away game. You got to do it more when you're on the road because you have limited assets you're going to be able to bring with you. If you're in DC, you can tap people that you deal with every day. You deal with the same people at DC Metro, the same people from FBI. You can get the same counter snipe people in the same buildings that are used to seeing it. So it changes when you start going to a new location. You're like, I got to touch a couple of people. You're working with a SWAT team of unknown experience. You're just getting a gut read on them, if you even do that. And they're going to give you some bodies and you're stuck with what you got. And they've got their own staffing because the job of the local PD is to do local PD stuff. They got to do traffic and they got to do investigations and they've got to go out there and do domestic response and all the other things that happen. So you're going to get what you get and you're going to decide, basically, people are going to decide right then and there, how good are these guys and how much of this pie can we bite off and give them to chew on? But at the end of the day, they own it. I mean, it's a Secret Service mission, which is why it's goofy they had so many people from DHS there. Just because they fall under DHS. HSI agents are not Secret Service. They don't train the same way. They don't have the same mission set. They don't have the skill set. And so that's why you saw a bunch of people that basically have probably watched, if you had to guess, I can tell you that the chubby chick that wasn't able to get her gun into a holster has probably never worn her holster like that with body armor on before under a jacket. She's probably worn it before, but not with the body armor on. That was number one. And then it was really obvious to me too, they probably only had maybe a couple of dry runs, if that. They probably watched a couple of PowerPoints on how you're going to protect the detail and collapse in on your principal. And so they were doing like, what the hell do I do? Where do my hands go? The classic moves of everybody's looking at me. I'm supposed to look like I'm doing something. I'm going to pull my gun out and put it at freaking Sewell and stand here like a tard. And then I'm going to figure out how to reholster and open a door. Like all of that was people who have never, they're trying out a brand new dance, but they haven't, this is at the prom. Like this is the big deal. And they didn't know how to do it. They've never done it before in public. And they looked exactly like you'd expect.
I'd like to defend that chubby chick if I can, because obviously it looks so ridiculous, with the holster. But if you look back at the footage, when the gunshots go off, the first shots, she's up there very quickly and she dives on top of Trump. She basically puts her body in between Trump and where the shots are coming from, which I think is very honorable, brave, very respectable.
Can
but
she
she's
make
not
a
known for
machine
that.
gun now? Can she make machine gun noises with her mouth? Because if she can't make a machine gun noise with her mouth, she has no business doing that job. That's what I have.
Like, that is the bare minimum of her competence expectancy. And
Yeah.
besides being able to have the bravery to go do her job, she also has to have weapons competence as a freaking Secret Service agent protecting the freaking president of the United States or former president of the United States. Like that is, and that's the problem. And Chris, your attitude is the problem and why DEI exists, because that's what happens. That's what happens in these. Again, I've trained DS agents. This is what happens. Like, hey, this person can't shoot. Yeah, but they write so beautifully and they do great things. And really at the end of the day,
put her life on the line to protect the president.
They find all these things that they do well, but the standards of their actual job, they're like, that's fine. They excuse them. You're the problem, Chris. That's why we're taking over Australia. You guys have screwed it up.
That's right. I co-sign on all of that.
Woo!
Well, I'm a bit of a contrarian. Everyone hates on that chick. I'll be that guy. I'd be like,
I
what?
like it.
Here's a hot take.
We could do the J6 thing. You threw it up earlier. People always want to ask. I'll just debunk it. There's nothing really exciting that I can tell people, but I like being transparent about it. There was a question about J6 bomber stuff. Look, my team did surveillance on the J6 and a person of interest for J6. We had a really good head start on where we should have been, and we got pulled off that case to evaluate leads, which was like, I knew Gary back in the day, and he really liked Ronald Reagan, so I think he's an a-hole, and I think he was at January 6th. Like, that's the kind of stuff that I got in emails, and you're like, dude. So instead of following a guy that supposedly was the ride or owned the vehicle that the J6 pipe bomb planter jumped into, we did that instead. And so that was what happened. That's what my knowledge of that thing was. I am told that the cell phone company actually does have actionable records, and the single tower dump that was not functional is in fact functional. So the FBI may have actually lied about that. And if they didn't, they did some nonsense that was real sketchy. They danced around the truth somehow that was not honest. The people that were there, like Steve D'Antuono, mediocre, regime follower, the folks that were above me didn't seem like it. They just fired off, from what I understand, the entire squad that was working on that right on day one. And people will find this very conspiratorial, and I can't help it. CI-14, Counterintelligence 14, was a Russian espionage squad. They're the ones that actually executed the search warrant over at Mar-a-Lago for Trump's documents. For whatever reason, their agents were also working on the pipe bomber case on day one. And I don't know why the hell that would be, because they weren't a counterterrorism squad and they weren't a manhunt squad. And that should have been the thing that the FBI's bread and butter is. Like, you identified a person, they were in a place at this time, there's 1 million federal cameras, there's a bunch of cell phones, there's a bunch of Wi-Fi networks that it probably pinged off on. We know the person had a cell phone and waved to a Capitol Police, or did something to a Capitol Police vehicle that drove by. That seems like a no-brainer that you'd be able to catch up on there. Do I know that that person was Capitol Police? I do not. There was some information that was dropped out recently and repackaged. It was something that came from a podcast that Tom Massey did with Matt Gaetz, and they were talking about the person that found the pipe bomb on the day of, so a different thing. So there's some information out there that's confusing. If people are really interested, I would follow Darren Beatty. He's been like a dog with a bone. He and I don't agree on everything, but that's fine. Steve Baker has been very good and like hot on the trail of this thing. Those are the two biggest on there, and I'm telling you what I know about it. I have places that they could have started, and it sounds like they may have exhausted that, but they've never testified to it out loud. So if that is information that needs to be done, I still have a file. I still have friends who are on that case. I can have them, reach out to Cash whenever he gets in, and they can run this stuff down. I expect that we'll actually know this in the next couple months. If there's any honesty and transparency, that is a thing that needs to be, because we can't have people dropping pipe bombs in the middle of Washington, D.C., whether they're fake or not, because they looked really, I was told they were very bomb-like right away, that they weren't real. But like, dude, you can't be dropping fake bombs in D.C. And how come it's never happened again? How did they know there was only 2 bombs and that was the end of it and there was never going to be another one, that it wasn't a serial bomber? How did anybody know that? And they just let it go. So all of that was real sketchy. I feel the same way your audience does about that one.
Well, and we know what level of CCT footage and surveillance capabilities are within DC. Like, you're not going to be able to drop that off and get within, it's like 30, 40 miles outside of the city before you're not hitting every single, even around here, every single traffic light. And this is only in this region. Like, every single traffic light has freaking camera footage, cameras on them, and it's not because they're wanting to catch people that are going through red lights. It is
and to be fair, they're crappy cameras. The government does like cheap out on this stuff. They don't maintain them well. I've tracked bank robbers, I've tracked armored car jobs and stuff like that. We've tracked people with them, and they're frustrating because they're not a good system, but they are capable of finding things. And, we've been able to ID vehicles and lost, guns thrown out of windows at high speed, things like, you could find stuff on them. So they are of value. And to think that we didn't, this is the train of evidence we had for people's awareness. The subject supposedly got into a metro station in Washington, D.C. and took it out to Falls Church, Virginia. We had the entry into the metro station with a card that went into the turnstile readers, and the same card was used to exit. The person that bought that card bought it with a credit card, so the credit card was identified, and that credit card went back to an address and a person who was also associated with the license plate of the vehicle that picked up the person when they came out in Falls Church. And we sat outside the house of the person that had the license plate and had the credit card, which is a freaking slam dunk as far as things go. And so we had that information. It's not useful to the public. You don't get to go be super sleuths. I'm not going to say it on a public thing because I don't know what that guy's involvement was. Maybe it was a girlfriend borrowed the car. Maybe somebody that was a friend borrowed the car. Maybe the guy himself was involved and didn't know what was happening. Any number of things could have happened. So I'm not outing random people, and I never will. I think it's totally irresponsible. But in the sake of transparency, that's the kind of information that the FBI had access to. And I'm just saying it so that people can understand, like, look, they had a really good place to start. And I know that they did a couple of days after January 6th. And my team, which was sitting on surveillance outside of that guy's house, and I still know the guy's address. Like I said, I could go find him. I've seen his social media. He looks pretty right-wing to me, unless he's an op, which is real possible because it's really right-wing and really sterile. It's almost alerting how vanilla right-wing this guy is, for whatever it's worth. But anyway, all of that being said, that doesn't mean he did anything wrong either. So I know that guy's out there. I know he exists. There are other people that know it. I've shared it with members of Congress. Whatever they do with that information, I hope they take it for what it's worth and do something valuable. I think the American people do deserve an answer, though. I wholly believe that because I don't have the full story, and I wouldn't keep it if I did. I mean, I would definitely be outing somebody if I knew more than that.
Do you think that we are going to see some major revelations once Kash Patel is in operational control? Or do you think, because we've seen this before where things tend to sizzle, and I don't know, I'm not very optimistic. People get in there and then it's just like Trump, his first term, he's like, I'm going to get out there and we're going to talk about, I'm going to show you guys the JFK. We're going to talk about, UFOs, UAPs, and, we're going to tell you where Elvis still lives. And then once he got in there, he kind of backed down for lots of different reasons about the JFK files, Martin Luther King files, among other things.
Well, they just declassified all that.
Yes.
So we're seeing it again. So yeah, that's a different animal. So maybe so. I'm cautiously optimistic. Let me just phrase it that way. Again, the status quo is the default position for anything in government, and not releasing information is far easier. One of the things that I have suggested publicly, and there's been some traction around the Trump folks that I've seen, is that the FBI needs to work on a way to get to yes. They need to redesign the FOIA process so that it can't be weaponized and hide information. That works for both people, by the way, whether they're conservatives or they're liberal. They should want government transparency. They shouldn't want the government to keep secrets. Anybody who argues on behalf of government secrets is a fool. They just don't understand it. There are things that need to be secret, but the answer should be default yes, except when we can't do it. So I'm a little bit more optimistic. I think Kash is a different kind of animal than you've ever seen in a role like that. All these guys have been basically white shoe lawyers that have worked in fancy firms and danced back and forth between government practice and then, working for the DOJ to get more credibility and contacts, and then going back and working for white shoe firms and making a bunch of money. Chris Wray made $9.25 million the year before he was the FBI director, and then came in and, took a $9 million pay cut. Kash is a different animal. I mean, he plays hockey in a men's league and gets punched in the face. He's like a regular dude. I mean, he drinks regular beers. I hang out with him one time when we were in Phoenix, and we haven't spent a lot of time together, but I was out there in Phoenix, and I came down, and Jason Aldean was playing at the event, and his security guard and his body, his personal protection, was run by, Green Beret, so that's pretty standard. And Kash is drinking with the dude who's the GB and not with the guy who's performing the concert. He's hanging out with the security element because they were cool dudes and fun. I end up talking to the guy and finding out that the guy went through the Q course with my last FBI partner, which was really funny. So we sent pictures back and forth. I'm like, look at this dude I just found. And he's like, whoa, haven't seen that guy in years. So that's the kind of people that Kash sought out, as opposed to people who are super famous. Does he rub elbows with famous people and people in power? Absolutely. but I've also found him to have a very common touch. And I think he has that same natural curiosity and instinct that most people do, which is like, hey, what the hell happened? What have we been paying for with our government? Like, where are the UFOs at? Like, where's Jimmy Hoffa? He wants to know that stuff too. And the things that he's read, everything I've seen him say to people like Glenn Beck or Sean Ryan indicates that attitude that he's going to be leaning towards trying to get to yes, which is more than we've ever had before. So I'm more optimistic than I've been previously.
I guess that was really my question. Like, you've talked to him. Do you feel like he's the real deal? And it sounds like you feel like he is.
I totally do. Yep.
I thought this comment that I was going to throw up is pretty funny. Clearly you're glowy to Randall Lindbergh here. Kyle, you just outed himself when he said Cash probably didn't need him. The Patriot would never say that. He would scream, sign me up.
Now, I don't want to work for the government again. I'm going to tell you straight up. Like right now, I go to work every day. I wake up at about between 5 and 6 a.m. I start making coffee. When my kids wake up, I'm there drinking coffee, checking the news, setting up my podcast. I give them a kiss and a hug. I go and I start my work. My commute is about 40 seconds going up the stairs and closing the door behind me. I do my job. I do all the work on the podcast. And then once I shut it down, I do my billing, my invoices, I do interviews with people that want to hear what I have to say. I'm out there doing free information. I'm basically a government transparency operative for free. And that's my full-time job. And I work a podcast part-time that pays my bills. And I don't want to go back and work for the government. Like I'm feral at this point, man. Like I'm totally, I haven't disclosed my finances to anybody. I don't answer to anybody. If I want to take a day off, I answer to me. If I want to fly to Vegas and go to SHOT Show and do a live broadcast with people out there, then that's what I do. And if I don't, then I don't. So there's no sick days in my job, and there's no pay floor, and I certainly don't get any vacation days. But at the end of the day, I am not interested in working for anybody else. I did the thing for the American government. The American government stabbed me. They left me. But if it comes back to where I'm standing and wants me to do the thing, I'm there to work. Like I'll do it, but I'm not thrilled about it, man. I will not. And I've told Cash the same thing because I don't want people to think like, oh, I'm just trying to get it. I hate those people. They're like, oh, I'm just trying to angle to get this thing back. Nope. I've moved on with my life. Like I've been an FBI agent. Nobody can take that away from me. I did what I thought was right. I'm going to be able to look my kids in the eyes when I'm on my deathbed and tell them that. And then if the country still needs me, I'm still here. If it comes back to where I'm at, I'm happy to keep working. And if not, no begging on my end. I'm perfectly happy being a podcast host. And this week, I'll tell you, has been a really good week to be a podcast host because I'm watching people in the Bureau that are pissing their pants everywhere, like on national television. It's amazing to watch it. And you just go like, man, I guess all the stuff I told you was true, folks. You should have been listening. They had a long time to come forward with information and they haven't. So people sorted themselves into camps right away, didn't they?
Oh, 100%. That's one of the things that really irritates me. There's so many people out there, including a lot of people that are bureaucrats and they're just part of the Washington swamp that claim that they would, take a bullet for this country, blah, 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 but you won't lose a job for this country.
That is the biggest statement you made.
And you people disgust me. I'm not going to lie. That's just how I feel. And working for, I was in the military, got out, took some different roles with the Department of State. Once I got our business to a point to where, I could do it full time and felt good about it, man, I couldn't get out of there fast enough. I don't miss anything about it. Well, folks, man, first of all, Kyle, were you at SHOT Show?
I was, yeah.
Nice. Yeah, so was I.
Were you at the Green Beret pool party?
I didn't go to that.
You didn't miss anything.
I don't like the parties, man. I'm there for business. I'm there to make some contacts and make some content. We made some good content while we were there. Yeah, and figure out what we're going to order for the year to sell to all of our freedom goods. Matter of fact, for all your freedom goods, make sure you go to ParamountTactical.com, buy all your stuff. But you mentioned Martinsburg, West Virginia. That's basically where we're at right here at our. Did you ever go to the Department of State facility? What was the ITF, which was BSR there in Summit Point, West Virginia?
I did not. No, I went to some stuff in Winchester a few numbers of times. There's some off the grid warehouses out there that we were doing some offsites and stuff like that, but I didn't ever go to Martinsburg. I followed a subject out there once. That was interesting. Yeah.
Well, if you're ever back up in the DC area, hit me up, man. I'll take you out. We'll do some shooting, go do some driving, and maybe a little bit of both.
There's a small chance that I have to say yes to that, in which case I'll be in the area and I'll be looking for people that also like to do shooting, because it's you can't just shoot in your backyard in Virginia, which I would like to be able to do, but there's a decent chance.
We got some great long range courses too. We'll treat you right. You just
All
let me
right,
know.
I got a new 6 arc I got to break in. My buddy just showed me it's like a sub 1/3 MOA gun built by a Bravo that just retired, and it's dirty. So yeah, I'm into it.
Nice. That's me, 18 Bravo, Knuckle Dragon Full. Well, listen, folks, I think we covered most of your questions out there. Listen, I really appreciate everybody tuning in. And most importantly, Kyle, I appreciate you coming on. And, man,
Yeah, thanks, Kyle.
Enlightening.
I had fun. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah,
Chris, we always love having you too, buddy, representing our 52nd state.
No. The proud sovereign country of Australia. Thank you very much.
All right, Kyle, stay tight. But again, make sure you guys like, subscribe, all those things. Kyle, definitely on X. And what are some other social media sites they can send to you? I'll make sure I'll put it in the description after it's not live anymore.
Yeah, sure. If people want to hear it, we do it in the morning on YouTube. We're on Rumble. We're on Spotify for the replay, but it's at 0930 Eastern time, and it's just at Kyle Seraphin. If you're looking at YouTube, if you're on Rumble, it's rumble.com/Kyle Seraphin. So pretty much my name everywhere you go. If you want to find us on locals, it's kyleseraphin.com. Makes it quite easy. And then if you're looking for Spotify, I got a cheat code for you. You could just go to kyleseraphinshow.com. So almost always my name will find you where I'm at. That's what I'm doing.
Google his name. He's on all the platforms. Simple as that. All right, folks, thanks for tuning in. Hope you guys enjoyed this. I know I did. It was very enlightening. And we look forward to, we'll have Kyle back on, I don't know, sometime soon. We'll definitely get him up here and go do some shooting with us. But anyways, folks, until next time, stay armed, stay ready. We'll talk to you soon.